Game of Thrones, The Wrath of the Sleeping Dragon. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 76, The King of God. Viserys thought about the strategic transfer plan for a long time on the returning ship, and finally decided to temporarily set the location at the starting point of the Upper Oin River. However, this place is far from the coast of Bravos, and the fleet that Viserys relies on cannot play a role on land. He can only rely on sailors to fight on the ship, which is undoubtedly giving up his own advantage. Fortunately, according to Viserys' understanding, there is no powerful force on the Andal Plain. At most, there are only some bandits and mountain bandits, and the Andal villages that are native to this land. Viserys led thousands of well-equipped Targaryen navy. Even if he fought on the ship, it should not be a big problem to conquer these mob bandits and villages. Of course, we are not going to give up Dragonstone immediately. Viserys continued. We can lead the people across the narrow sea in batches and steps to build our home in the eastern continent. After all, a city cannot be built in a day. Even if Viserys spends money like water to hire a large number of workers, it will not be so easy. So this is a big project that will last for many years, and Baratheon now has no navy to attack Dragonstone, which is the best opportunity for them to get through this difficult time. When one day Baratheon has accumulated enough strength and wants to attack Dragonstone again, he will find that the island has been emptied by Viserys. However, Viserys only proposed a plan, which does not mean that he is the only one who can decide on this matter. It still needs to be discussed in the royal meeting to finally determine the best result. Do you have any good ideas for the next plan? Viserys glanced at Prince Oberyn, who was sitting in a chair casually, and the old knight on his left, who was serious and thoughtful. You might as well speak freely. Viserys is good at listening to others' opinions. He will not be a dictator, and he cannot be a dictator. Although the Little King has been sitting on the throne, the power of the Dragonstone Navy is still in the hands of the fleet commander Sir Geoffrey. Viserys has never forgotten this, and reminds himself to keep a clear mind at all times. Of course, this does not mean that Viserys is worried that the old knight will rebel. In fact, among the people he trusts most, apart from the instructor of the Red Castle, the only one left is Sir Geoffrey. Because without these two people, he might have died long ago. However, although the commander of the Dragonstone fleet is currently assisting the young king, this does not mean that the old knight will let Viserys do whatever he wants in everything. This is a very important difference. The old man has actually always put himself in the position of minister entrusted with the care of the orphan. He feels that he should do his best and take on more responsibilities. So on some key issues, if there is a huge difference of opinion between the young king and the prime minister, the final right to speak will still fall into the hands of the other party. Because the command of the fleet is in the hands of the other party, it is extremely difficult for Viserys to take back this part of power. The old man only needs to say, Your Majesty is still young, I'm doing this for your own good, and you will understand when you grow up. He can fight back what Viserys wants to say. This is the real living environment that Viserys is in now. When Oberyn was in Bravos, he asked Viserys how he felt about being called the king at such a young age. Viserys answered Oberyn's question in a clever way. However, in the face of such a dilemma, Viserys did not confront the old knight for the command of the fleet, because the old knight himself was loyal to Targaryen and had a good purpose. But Viserys did not completely surrender and give up the struggle. He was also trying to improve his voice and master some of his own power. This was also one of the reasons why he persuaded himself to insist on taking the risk to go to Bravos. Fortunately, the Little King won the gamble. He achieved the desired results in his mission to Bravos, and received the two major backing and support from Bravos and Dorne. Now Viserys not only relies on the power of the Dragonstone fleet, but also has the support of Dorne and Bravos. Although this is also a power that he cannot control, getting rid of the dependence on a single force also indirectly improves the Little King's own voice. Just like the situation in front of us. Prince Oberyn from Dorne sat on Viserys' right hand. Although he didn't say a word, Sir Geoffrey had to consider his opinion. and Viserys could find a little breathing space in the balance of power between the three parties, which were all huge for him, and gradually master his own right to speak by balancing the left and right. Your Majesty. The grey-haired old man was silent for a long time. He first raised his head and looked at the Prince of Dawn, who was picking his teeth on the chair opposite. Then he turned his head and looked at Viserys, and then took the initiative to break the silence in the table hall and spoke first. Andals is the homeland of the Andals, and you are the legitimate king of the Andals, the Rhoynar and the First Men. As a king, you have the ownership of the whole territory and the final decision-making power. The Andals and their land should be subject to you, so it is legally impeccable for you to take back this piece of land. Sir Geoffrey dug the root of the matter for Viserys and found the legitimacy of conquering and occupying this land. And according to legend, this is also the birthplace of the Seven Gods. The Seven Gods once descended to this mountain and blessed the Andals. Legend has it that the Father God took 7 stars from the sky and made a crown to crown the first king of Andals, King Hugo of the Hills. And you returned to Andals in pursuit of the Holy Trail, seeking the 7 gods to answer your doubts, how to save beggars, civilians, nobles and other sentient beings from the suffering of oppression by usurpers. Your Majesty, you are the king favored by the gods. The old knight's old and powerful voice echoed in the silent table hall. The 7 gods will crown you again. You will lead his faithful believers to reintegrate the Andal people's homeland until you return to Westeros. Eliminate the suffering of all beings and restore the glory of the 7 gods without being tainted by despicable usurpers. And you are the messenger who carries out the will of the gods. A month later, the old knight's sonorous and powerful voice seemed to still not dissipate in my ears. Beep. On the rough sea, the horn of war was desolate and melodious, making people's blood boil. The 3-headed dragon flag of Targaryen fluttered in the wind, and countless large ships lined up in formation to cut through the waves. And the continent in the distance seemed to be looming. Chapter 77 Shadow Bobcat. In the endless green fields, a young man wearing a fur vest and carrying a bow and arrows was lying in the grass, carefully pushing aside the branches in front of him and moving forward. The boy's skin was slightly dark, and he looked only 13 or 14 years old, but his body was extremely agile, and there was a 7-pointed star symbol engraved on the bulging muscles of his arms. At this moment, the boy looked at an adult male deer that had left the tribe not far away, lowering his head and nibbling on the weeds on the ground, breathing a little faster. If he could successfully hunt it and even peel off a complete deer skin and then take it to the caravan passing through the village to exchange for money, he might be able to exchange it for a month's rations for his family. However, just as the boy was breathing a little faster and thinking about it, he saw that the male deer seemed to have noticed something and raised his head with some vigilance. Oh no. The boy's heart tightened slightly when he saw this scene, and he quickly held his breath. He knew that this kind of creature was very vigilant and would be scared away by the slightest movement. Hey, Bessie, what are you doing? At this moment, a big face suddenly appeared in front of the boy, and the boy lying in the bushes was so scared that his heart almost stopped. The bushes on this side shook gently and made a noise. The stag that was grazing leisurely on the other side ran away without a second of hesitation. The man was startled, and the prey also escaped. The boy named Bessie was so angry that he almost died. He grabbed his friend's collar and shouted loudly in his ear, "Mill, you bastard." The boy named Mill, who had just played a prank, covered his ears and begged for mercy. He felt that his ears were about to be deafened by his companions shouting, "Bessie, I was wrong. I really didn't see it just now." However, when the two boys were playing, roar! Exclamation mark. A deafening roar broke out in the jungle on the other side. A beast with black stripes on its fur suddenly rushed out of the woods and pounced on the stag that had just run away. The two teenagers who were fighting each other were stunned when they saw this scene. Their hands froze in place and they dared not move. It turned out that when Bessie had just set her eyes on the stag that had left the tribe, another terrifying predator also set its eyes on the other party. The fight between Bessie and me just now startled the stag, and the stag turned around and ran away, making the beast mistakenly think that it was exposed, so it chased after it directly. It's a shadow mountain cat. Although the beast was extremely fast, the teenager Bessie, who had a 7-pointed star mark engraved on his arm, instantly recognized the true identity of the beast. It turned out to be an extremely rare shadow mountain cat that usually lives in mountainous terrain. The fur of this precious beast is very valuable. On the other side, Mia, the boy who had just played a prank, was terrified and grabbed his companion's arm. "Hey, Bessie, I just saved you." Shadow cats are not easy to mess with, although they will not attack humans unless they are very hungry. But they are still one of the overlords in the forest, strong, ferocious and extremely fast, with extremely sharp claws, and can climb trees. As long as you are targeted by it in the forest, there is almost no way to survive. And just now this shadow cat actually targeted the stag. If his companion Bessie hunted the deer without knowing it, and the pair of dark eyes were still hiding in the dark and observing quietly, then I'm afraid that what awaits Bessie next will be a very miserable fate. The young man Mill was not so courageous. When he saw this shadow cat pounce out of the darkness, he felt his legs a little weak. However, the other boy Bessie did not say a word, watching the disappearing figures of one chasing and one fleeing, and he didn't know what he was thinking, and then he gritted his teeth slightly. He knew that the fur of the shadow mountain cat was very valuable. If he could successfully hunt it, Bessie's family was a bit miserable. He lived in a village not far away where Andals gathered. Not long ago, his father was robbed by members of the Brotherhood when he was returning from selling things in a nearby town. His body was found a few days later and was taken back to the village for burial. As the pillar of the family, his father fell. Now Bessie's family really needs money. Chase. The young Bessie gritted his teeth and finally made up his mind. He ran in the direction where the shadow mountain cat and the stag fled and chased them. "Hey, Bessie, what are you doing?" When his companion Mill saw this scene, he could only stomp his feet hard and chase after it. He couldn't let his companion chase the fierce shadow mountain cat alone. The stag ran in front and went into the jungle, and the shadow mountain cat also chased in. The forest was the home of this beast. The two teenagers followed in and didn't know how long it had been running out. The shadow mountain cat had already disappeared. The two teenagers chased the traces left on the ground, still searching hard and unwilling to give up. "I must not give up. I need this money." The teenager gritted his teeth and tried hard to chase the traces left by the shadow mountain cat. The front was about to get out of the jungle again. However, at this moment, Bessie seemed to hear a voice speaking outside the jungle not far away. "Prince Aberon's spearmanship is really amazing. He actually killed a shadow mountain cat without any injury." Several knights in armor tied their horses to the tree trunks, holding the hilts of their swords with one hand and commenting. Looking at the shadow mountain cat that had just died on the ground, the wound was still oozing blood, and the body was not even stiff yet. Not far away, there were more than 100 Targaryen soldiers sitting on the grass, and some standing in place looking at the situation here. Just now, a shadow mountain cat suddenly rushed out for some reason, as if it wanted to attack a Baron who was eating, and then the Prince of Dawn grabbed the spear at hand and killed it directly. The spear tip went up from the side of the back, pierced the throat, and nailed the male shadow mountain cat to the ground. Baron himself seemed very calm and seemed not to hear the praise from others. He rubbed the blood on the spear tip with the sole of his boot and then took out a dagger wrapped in animal skin from his waist. Then he skillfully stabbed the dagger directly into the belly of the shadow mountain cat and then slashed it downward fiercely, directly digging open the belly of the prey. Puff! In an instant, blood gushed out, as if it was free. Baron used to be among mercenaries, so he was naturally familiar with dissecting fur. At this time, no one noticed that in the jungle not far away, there were two pairs of terrified eyes looking at them. Then they quickly disappeared from the spot. Chapter 78, Gaining a Foothold. It's bad. Bessie and Mia, two teenagers, have been walking through the hills and jungles for many years, so they are naturally very familiar with the terrain. They are strong and run fast, and soon they pushed through the jungle and escaped back to the village, shouting loudly. The shouts of the two teenagers soon alarmed the adults in the Andal village. Men carrying shovels and pickaxes rushed out and then saw that it was Bessie and Mia. "Hey, what's wrong? What happened?" A group of adults surrounded Bessie and Mia, holding their own weapons. The Andal villages nearby are often attacked by bandits and brotherhoods, and even by the Nuna villages not far away near the Upper Oin River. so every village here has its own armed forces, and they spontaneously organized to protect their homes. When they heard the shouts of the two teenagers, they thought it was another bandit brotherhood coming to rob, but after rushing out, they found that nothing had happened. We saw a group of them at the North Mountain. The young man Bessie, who had a 7-pointed star on his shoulder, ran a little out of breath, and then hurriedly explained. A group. However, he was a little dumb when he got to this point, because he didn't know how to continue. This group of people were well equipped and uniform, and they were not members of the Brotherhood at first glance. Moreover, there were 3-headed dragon emblems on their armor and shields. Bessie felt vaguely familiar, as if he had heard of it somewhere. But for a moment, he couldn't remember which noble lord's emblem it was. Hey, Kit, what exactly is this group of people? Wolves. At this time, a tall man also pushed the crowd and walked in, and his arm was also engraved with a 7-pointed star. This is a custom of the Andals. It was first recorded when the Andals left Essos and sailed west to Westeros and landed on the Five Fingers Peninsula to attack the valley. The Andal warriors would paint or carve the 7-pointed star symbol representing the faith of the 7 gods on their skin. However, when the village was noisy, outside the Andal village, trample, tramp, tramp, several knights on war horses took the lead and came to the main entrance of the village. One of them held high the flag with the 3-headed dragon symbol of Targaryen, while the others held their weapons tightly. The leader among the knights was Prince Oberyn, who was rarely seen wearing armor. Although Dragonstone was full of navy and war horses were scarce, they could still gather 100 or 200 mounts, including the nags. War horses accounted for about half of them, and they were given priority to these knights with riding experience. Following these knights were hundreds of Targaryen soldiers, wearing neat light armor, and equipped with short swords and shields, as well as double-edged battle axes and bows and arrows. Crash. Then these Targaryen soldiers surrounded the village, holding high their shields, and drawing their shining swords. The people in the village were frightened and confused when they saw this scene. Adults cried and children made a fuss, and they had no idea what was going on. Hey, who can tell me what happened? Who are they? If only a dozen bandits and members of the Brotherhood came here to rob, these villagers could still muster up the courage to resist. However, now hundreds of fully armed Targaryen soldiers surrounded the entire village, and there were even several knights who were covered in armor and armed to the teeth. The crude weapons and farm tools in their hands could not even knock open the armor of these knights, which made them not even have the courage to resist. And Oberyn sat upright on the warhorse, holding the reins with one hand and holding the spear with the other. A pair of dark eyes looked at the Andal village not far away, looking a little indifferent. My lord. At this time, the village finally sent a respected old man to talk. Although this Andal village is relatively closed, there are still caravans passing by here and bringing some news from the outside world. Among them, someone identified that this is the flag of the Targaryen family, the king of the 7 kingdoms on the other side of the Narrow Sea. For a moment, they thought that the king on the other side of the Narrow Sea had come to conquer this land. I must remind you that a castle cannot be built overnight, even if it is only a wooden one now. Your Majesty. Viserys, dressed in neat clothes and wearing a crown inlaid with rubies, stood on a hill not far away and looked at the castle under expedited construction. The felled giant trees were transported over, tied with ropes, and hung up with the shouts of the workers. At this time, Viserys heard a voice from behind. The little king tilted his head slightly. The wind on the hill was a little strong, blowing his silver gold hair. It turned out that the person who spoke was Gunther, who had just joined the Targaryen family. At this moment, the young bachelor was wearing a thin grey bachelor's robe. He was shivering from the cold at the top of the hill, and his nose was a little red. He couldn't help sneezing. However, even so, Gunther felt that there were some things that he had to make clear to the little king, lest the lord he served go astray, not to mention that Viserys was just a child. He would not allow himself to watch the birth of a future Mad King. Of course I know, Meester. The castle was not built overnight, so I spent so much money. Viserys glanced at Meester Gunther, who was shivering with cold, then retracted his gaze, tugged at his deerskin gloves and said calmly, "It cost so much." Meester Gunther was so angry that his nose almost crooked when he heard Viserys' words. Your Majesty, do you think that letting soldiers plunder the surrounding villages cost a lot? Is it the physical strength of the soldiers? This young Mr. who looked only in his 20s and the little king who was only 8 years old started a dispute, which looked a little funny. However, Viserys was rarely stunned when he heard the Meester's words, then turned his head, looked at the other party up and down seriously, and then spoke. Meester Gunnar, do you think I'll let soldiers plunder the surrounding villages? Viserys asked back. What else? Meester Gunnar did not back down at all. His grey-brown eyes were serious. He believed that mistakes were not terrible and could be corrected. He was now persuading his lord to take the right path. Who are they? Then, the Meester pointed to a group of laborers in tattered clothes and chains not far away. If they slacked off in their work, the soldiers who were watching them would whip them without hesitation. Snap. Then he fell to the ground, groaned for a long time, as if cursing the soldiers, and then got up again, after receiving the second whip. No. However, Viserys shook his head. Meester Gunnar, I'm afraid you misunderstood. They are the bandits and members of the Brotherhood who have been wiped out during this period. These people used to harm the people here. It's a bargain for them to let them build the castle now. Chapter 79 Faith and Money. A few days later, a long team stretched out for a long distance. Every household in the Andal village packed up their luggage and prepared for a migration of the whole clan. Bessie, are we really going to move as a whole clan? At this time, another young man, Mia, ran from the back to the front of the team without knowing how far he had run. He found his friend Bessie, who had a 7-pointed star engraved on her shoulder, and asked. They didn't even know what happened. They just saw that day a group of fully armed regular soldiers surrounded the village. Then the chief went out to negotiate with the other party, begging them to hand over some property so that the other party would let them go. However, the distance was too far, and they didn't know what the two sides talked about. Then they saw the knight riding a tall horse, ordered his servant to hand over a heavy bag to the chief. Then the chief came back with a smile on his face, and the soldiers who surrounded the village quickly retreated. Then a few days later, the chief summoned representatives from each household in the village, and then there was a news that the Andal king returned to Indus. His Majesty the king was blessed by the 7 gods, and was the messenger of the gods in the world. The Father of Heaven took down 7 stars from the sky to crown his Majesty the king, etc. Finally, the whole tribe moved to Andalus, a city newly built by his Majesty the king, which was only inhabited by Andals. From then on, the Andals would no longer be oppressed by the Roina villages on both sides of the Roina River. These two once glorious tribes have now been shattered under the long river of history. Although there are many people on the continent of Westeros, only the Andals and Roina who have maintained their traditions and pure blood are left. The two races now only have village level fights. Such exciting news quickly spread throughout the village, and then, under the leadership of the patriarch, the entire village moved to their dream home. 7 gods above. It turns out that the merciful Father still loves us. The Andals moved thousands of miles with a pilgrimage mentality to the starting point of the Upper Oin River. Their Andal king, who was crowned by the 7 gods, built a new city here, and their pious mentality was almost a prayer for every step. On the way to the relocation of this village, they also met people from other Andal villages, who seemed to be moving their entire families to the city of Andalus. The two migrating teams met, but each remained vigilant, did not actively communicate, and continued to walk towards the destination in silence. The young man Bessie held a dagger at his waist in one hand, and carried a simple bow and arrow on his back. He looked vigilantly at the Andal team that was also moving not far away, and the men in many villages around him did the same. Then he saw that the other party really had no ill intentions, and then he slightly let down his guard, and then turned to look at his companions. Now it looks like we are really going to move there, the young man said in a calm voice. Why? Doesn't this sound like a lie? When another teenager, Mia, heard that his companion was also stubborn, he became anxious. The 7 gods abandoned us long ago, otherwise we wouldn't be bullied by the hateful Roina. Mia's voice was a little impatient. He felt that everyone in the village was crazy, and he was the only smart one. And where did a king crowned by the 7 gods come from? However, Mia's words shocked his companion Bessie. He didn't expect that his friend would question the 7 gods. Then Bessie's eyes widened, and he started to scold. Shut up, Mia. Don't say it anymore. He was the son of a warrior selected from the village. Although he was not a knight and had not been anointed with holy oil, there were no such good conditions in a small village. He could be selected as a warrior son and guard the will of the 7 gods just because he was strong and good at fighting. Bess's arm was also engraved with the symbol of the 7-pointed star. This was his pride and belief, so he naturally did not allow his companions to question the existence of the 7 gods. Bess's scolding was a little loud, which immediately attracted the attention of the surrounding villagers. The young warrior son took a deep breath, then waved his hand to tell the surrounding villagers that nothing had happened and that he and me were just chatting. Me was a very timid person, and he shrank his neck in fear when he was scolded by his companions. Then, he was surrounded by the eyes of the surrounding villagers, and his anger just now disappeared. Remember me, don't say such stupid things again in the future. The light of the 7 gods cannot be questioned. After Bessie explained it clearly to the surrounding villagers, he turned his head and pinched Mi's shoulders and spoke to his companions in a calm voice. His anger just now also dissipated a lot because he knew that Mi was such a person who spoke without restraint, and sometimes he didn't know what he was saying when he was anxious. Mi nodded like pounding garlic. Forget it. Then Bess's eyes flashed slightly, and then he shook his head and took a deep breath and said, "In fact, I also think this matter is a bit strange, but there is no way. My mother is willing to move, and it's almost time now." Bessie was also a little helpless about this. The relocation of the whole family was not a forced order. A considerable number of people chose to stay, while some chose to leave. It is hard to leave one's hometown. Bessie did not want to leave her homeland, but she did not know why her mother insisted on moving. The boy could not argue with his mother, and his father had just died not long ago. Bessie did not want to anger her mother, so she had to choose to follow her. The same was true for Mi's parents. After receiving a sum of money, they chose to follow the patriarch to Andalus City. Mir also could not argue with his parents, so he could only hold back his resentment. Faith offensive plus money offensive. Your Majesty is indeed a good method. In the so-called Andalus City, Viserys has been learning to ride a horse these days. Now he is sitting on the back of a little white horse. He can walk back and forth by holding the harness tightly, but Viserys cannot accurately control the direction. Standing under the horse was a young man with black hair, still wearing a thin bachelor's robe, but with an extra cloak, still shivering a little in the wind, walking with Viserys and talking. "Really? Mr. Gunner, you are too kind." Viserys held the saddle with one hand, his cheeks slightly tense. He didn't want others to see his nervousness caused by not knowing how to ride a horse, still pretending to be calm, and then spoke. Chapter 80 Andalus City. I don't know how long this long warm winter that has lasted for several years will last. Although the winter in Andalus is not too cold, I can't let the warriors spend the winter in a thin tent. Viserys grabbed the harness with one hand, then lowered his head to look at Mr. Gunner standing under the horse. "Mr. Your Majesty." The black-haired Mr. rubbed his nose. He always felt that he was going to catch a cold. "Convey my order." When Viserys was sitting on his little white horse and was about to say something, he suddenly saw another team migrating from afar in the distance. These people took the initiative to migrate to the city of Andalus, which was still under construction, under his faith plus money offensive. Tap tap tap. In the densely stationed Targaryen camp, 2 knights rode out on war horses to ask about the other party's intentions and check their identities. Viserys looked at the team coming from afar in the distance, and then retracted his gaze. Such teams appear every day these days, and it is no longer surprising. Let them build their own settlement. Then, Viserys remembered what he had not finished saying just now, and added, "Mr. Convey my order. Let these captives be divided into 3 groups, to work overtime overnight to build the castle. I don't want the progress to stop for a second. Do you understand?" Viserys' cheeks were tense, and his voice was calm, but it was unquestionable. Then the little king pulled the reins to try to make the little white horse understand his meaning, and turned the horse's head to the distance. The sound of horse hooves rolled up the grass leaves on the ground, and his voice came along. "Tell them. Let them go after the castle is built. Of course, if these robbers can still live until then." Viserys rode away from the hill. In the distance, the newly migrated Andal team was communicating with 10 knights riding out of the military camp. In this team, 2 teenagers saw the city of Andalus that had been rumored in the past few days, and also saw the boy riding away not far away. That must be the son of this king, me said sourly. Although he didn't know much about horses, just looking at the horse's coat shining in the sun and the gorgeous clothes on the boy sitting on the horse were enough to prove that the other party's identity was not simple, and there were followers around him. He saw Mr. Gunda. At this moment, the Meester was left behind by Viserys and ate some dust. He patted his clothes with a dusty face, then shook his head to convey Viserys' order. He knew that Viserys kept his word. Since he said that he would release these robbers after the castle was built, he would definitely do it. However, what would happen after releasing these robbers, Mr. Gunda didn't know. In short, he felt that these guys who were causing trouble in this land might not get a good end. On the other side, as the son of a warrior in the village, the young Bessie frowned slightly when he heard his companion's words. He really couldn't bear to interrupt him, but his friend's uncultured appearance did make him a little embarrassed, so he interrupted. Stop talking. Do you think the king's son is also called a son? The young me was a little confused when he heard his words. Isn't he the king's son? The king was cheated. Bessie heard his companion's silly words and once again rubbed his temples slightly with a headache. Of course not. I have always advised you to broaden your horizons. The sons of noble lords are called young masters, and the king is the greatest noble lord. What do you think he should be called? Bessie said while looking at the back of Viserys leaving not far away. In fact, he was also envious. His dream was to become a knight, and he hoped that one day he could ride a tall horse. He didn't tell his companions that in addition to his mother's will, he actually wanted to move here a little bit, because he knew very well that this was the closest opportunity for him to get close to the nobility in his life. He had never seen a noble lord before, and according to the clan leader, there was a king here. What is a king? The young man didn't even dare to think about it. In his impression, it was a noble who was more powerful than a noble. It was so high that Bessie knelt on the ground and looked up, but she couldn't see the supreme power, even if she broke her neck. This naturally aroused the ambition of the young Bessie. He wanted to get a chance to show off in front of this king and then be canonized as a knight. His companions naturally didn't know the ambition of the young man and just asked in a daze. The greatest noble? What should the king's son be called? I say you are really stupid. Of course he should be called young master. No, it's the eldest young master. While the 2 young men were chatting, the conversation in front seemed to have achieved results. Then the migrating team moved again, heading towards the city gathered under the castle on the hill in the distance. Ding ding ding. In the city of Andalus, the craftsmen were waving hammers and driving wooden stakes into the ground. Bring this wood over here. Hurry up. An Andal who was standing on the roof and building his home called out. Today, the city of Andalus has gathered more than 10,000 people, all of whom are Andal people who migrated from nearby villages. Early on, the castle on the hill in Andalus began to build its home. One wooden house after another rose from the ground, densely guarding the large wooden castle in the middle. When the new city was built, it could only be temporarily built with wood to speed up the race against time, and then replaced with stone when everything was mature. The geographical location of Andalus was also very good. 6,000 years ago, it was the battlefield for the Andals and the Rhoynar to fight for hegemony. It was an important strategic location, and also the site of an ancient Rhoynar city. More than 6,000 years ago, the Andals launched repeated attacks from the Rhoynar River to attack the Rhoynar's territory, but they were defeated again and again. Then the Andals chose another direction to break through and crossed the narrow sea to invade Westeros. When Viserys chose the site, he first set a general direction on the map and chose this place with plains suitable for growing crops by the mountains and rivers, and it also had certain strategic significance. Then when the little king led his army to this land, he made some changes and finally set the location on this hill. This hill is where the castle was built. The hill is backed by the upper Rhoynar River. It is an absolute commanding height within a radius of dozens of kilometers, overlooking the entire plain. If the castle is built here, it will not be so easily captured, even if it encounters a siege in the future. Sorry, I sent the wrong paper, covering my face. Chapter 81 5 years. Year 289 of the Conquest era. Time flies. Ever since Viserys went to Bravos alone and reached an alliance with Bravos and Dawn, won the acquiescence of Bravos, and then led the fleet across the narrow sea to the homeland of the Andals, the fleeing Targaryen embers finally escaped the sword of the usurper hanging over their heads and found a place to stand. Then they gathered the surrounding Andal villages and built a city on this land, Andalus. And now, in the blink of an eye, 5 years have passed. Under the clear and bright sky, flocks of crows landed on the spire of the castle's high tower. Flutter, then the black wings vibrated, the crow raised its beak to peck at its feathers, and then raised its head again, and the scene under the high tower was reflected in its scalded eyes. This is a flat parade ground, a wide horse racetrack. 2 knights wearing helmets and armor sitting on war horses are facing each other, each adjusting their equipment. On one side was a white horse, and on the other side of the racetrack was a strong black horse, which whistled slightly. The knight on the white horse looked a little thinner, and his whole body was covered with polished silver armor. He was bending over on the horse's back to adjust his shin guard, making a sound of metal friction. The black horse knight on the other side looked a little taller, and his whole body was covered with heavy armor. The black horse looked a little anxious, constantly whistling, while the white horse on the other side was a little excited and stepped restlessly on the horse's hooves. Both knights held the wooden lances used for the competition in one hand, but the tip of the lance had been replaced with an unsharpened, polished arc-shaped blunt head. Then both sides were ready, silent, and just made a gesture. Outside the racetrack, a grey-haired old man sitting on a chair saw that the two were ready, coughed violently for a moment, and then waved his hand. Begin. Accompanied by the grey-haired old man on the sidelines, he gave an order. The white horse knight did not wear a shield, but held the reins with one hand, and then suddenly squeezed the horse's belly with his legs. The white horse, which had been eager to try for a long time, rushed out suddenly, its snow-white mane spread out in the wind, shining like an angry lion. On the other side, the silent black horse knight also urged his horse to rush out at the same time, holding the lance tightly in one hand, and raising the round shield tied to his left arm with the other hand. The scope of the racecourse is not actually very large, but it is enough for the two horses to speed up and rush forward. Rumble. The galloping horse's hooves rolled up the dust in the venue and made a huge roar, and the two knights rushed towards each other. People borrow horsepower, and horses borrow human prestige. On the battlefield, a knight covered with plate armor, both man and horse, sprinted at full speed like a savage tank, almost indestructible, carrying a strong deterrent and impact. In a flash, the two knights were already very close, and they could even see each other's eyes through their visors. Their eyes crossed, and the black horse knight saw each other's eyes, and his heart skipped a beat for no reason. Then there was no time to think, and the two horses were about to cross each other. Almost in a flash, the two knights raised their lances high and aimed at each other. The black horse knight had an extra shield tied to his left arm, and he also raised it to block in front of himself. The next second, boom, wood chips flew. A white horse and a black horse crossed each other and burst into a huge sound. The lance in the hand of the white horse knight broke at this moment and turned into wood chips all over the sky. On the castle, in front of an open window, stood a graceful girl with beautiful long brown hair, fair cheeks, and a pair of clear eyes like water. At this moment, she was standing in front of the window watching the lance competition below, and then she saw this sudden scene and let out a slight cry. Viserys. He covered his mouth subconsciously. However, off the field, when the two horses crossed, the lance in the hands of the white horse knight broke with a bang, but the knight riding the black horse, who was taller, was thrown directly from the horse's back to the ground. Plop, the tin can fell heavily to the ground, making a dull sound, and then could not move. The black horse ran forward for more than 10 meters before finding that the owner had fallen off the horse. Rumble, and the knight riding the white horse did not rein in the war horse, holding the broken lance with only a wooden pole left in one hand, and threw it to the land outside the racecourse. Then the war horse ran forward for more than 10 meters, and waited for the inertia of the charge to completely dissipate, then reined in the reins, and turned the horse's head, turned around the fence from the other side of the racecourse, and ran back again. Crash. The victorious knight turned over from the war horse, the armor made a sound, and then directly pulled open the visor covering his face, and took off the helmet on his head. The clean and handsome face underneath was revealed, and the long silver gold hair hung on the cold armor. It was the young King Viserys. Then the young knight bent down, holding the helmet with one hand, and stretched out the other hand. "Bessie, how is it?" The knight lying on the ground was in a big shape. His chest kept rising and falling, and he was breathing heavily. A deep dent was smashed on Bessie's breastplate, and now his chest is also aching, but fortunately the bone should not be broken. But now he doesn't want to move at all, and even wants to give up treatment. Just now, when the two horses crossed in the lance duel, the speed was too fast. The victory or defeat in the lance duel was decided in an instant. Except for the two knights fighting, few people could see what happened. Bessie raised her lance high and put up her shield at the same time, but Viserys had an unexpected reaction speed and slightly turned sideways to avoid his lance. At the same time, the lance in Viserys' hand knocked away the shield in his hand and directly hit Bessie's heaviest breastplate and then knocked him to the ground. He fell to the ground. At this time, Bessie heard the sound of horse hooves coming from his ears. His big black horse ran back again and kept nudging him with its head, as if it was afraid that its master had been thrown to death. At the same time, Viserys also jumped off the horse and took the initiative to extend his hand. "I'm fine, your majesty." Snap. Then Bessie held the little king's hand and was pulled up from the ground. It's just that the loss was a bit too tragic, and it hurts a bit to fall. Bessie took off the helmet on his head, revealing a slightly dark cheek and dark hair, and smiled bitterly. At the same time, he seemed to see Princess Rhaena seemed to be watching the battle, and then raised her head. However, there was no one at the open window of the castle. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 82, Courage. Since you have been learning from Prince Oberyn, your skills are truly amazing. While the two knights were talking under their horses, the grey-haired old man who had just been sitting on a chair outside the Rattacourse came over with a cane and spoke in a hoarse voice. "I really have nothing to teach you, Sir William." Bessie turned her head when she heard the grey-haired old man's voice and hurriedly saluted respectfully. This grey-haired old man has been teaching him the way of knights, not only skills such as riding, spearing, and swordsmanship, but also the honor and duties that a knight's heart should abide by. When Viserys heard the voice, he turned his head and looked at the grey-haired old man. His eyes condensed, and his good mood just now became a little heavy. Then he spoke in a deep voice. "Coach." The grey-haired old man, whose body shape is very different from the past, is the former coach of the Red Castle, Sir William Derry. However, because of his old injuries, he did not receive timely treatment, missed the best time, and left a difficult to eradicated root of the disease. In just 6 years, this once high-spirited, brave, and warlike knight was left with only a withered and skinny appearance. His black hair had turned grey, one eye was half blind, and he had to walk with a cane at the age of 40. However, the coach had taught countless disciples, and even now he was unwilling to be idle, wanting to burn out his last remaining heat. The newly recruited young man in the castle still needed to be trained and polished by him before he could become a qualified warrior. As a person who migrated from the Andal settlement village, the young Bessie was one of the soldiers trained by Sir William. He had good talent and extraordinary courage, and was then recommended by Sir William to become Viserys' personal attendant. Afterwards, Bessie followed Viserys out to clear the trade route and eliminate the bandits entrenched in the Northwest Mountains. He repeatedly charged forward and made military exploits. Then Viserys drew his sword and put it on his shoulder and personally canonized him as a knight. Viserys himself has also led soldiers to eliminate bandits in recent years, personally killed and executed many criminals, and his personal strength has been significantly improved. However, Knight Bessie, who is known for his extraordinary courage, was knocked off his horse in one round in the confrontation with the Little King. Such strength also made Coach William feel amazed. Prince Oberyn dueled with Lord Dormund Ironwood because of an affair at the age of 16 and killed him personally. Viserys' brother Prince Rhaegar had just come into contact with long swords and armor at the age of 15, but he could also defeat a knight alone on horseback. Viserys was younger than both of them at the time, but he also achieved such an achievement, defeating Knight Bessie, who was already 19 years old, single-handedly, and without the other party letting him go. Although one of Coach William's eyes was half blind, his other eye was still sharp. This is the most amazing thing. The coach can clearly see that Viserys is indeed stronger than his carefully trained disciples. Whether it was his courage, speed, reaction, or superb spearmanship, Viserys could still easily win, even if he had to fight again a few times. If King's Landing held a tournament, with your current strength, I'm afraid you would have a chance to get a good result. Coach William, leaning on his cane, gave Viserys a high evaluation. There were many warriors in the Seven Kingdoms, and it was already exaggerated that Viserys could enter the tournament. However, the coach believed that Viserys could achieve certain results. Maybe. At this time, the grey-haired old man paused for a while, and then spoke in a hoarse voice. Your Majesty can personally avenge your father and brother in the future, and kill Robert Baratheon, the Kingslayer, and the Mountain. Viserys stood there with one hand holding his helmet. He was silent for a while after hearing what the coach said. Bessie, who had a deep dent on her breastplate on the other side, heard what the coach said, and secretly glanced at the little king. Since passing the selection, and entering the castle, and even being recommended to become Viserys' personal guard, Bessie gradually learned some things. The Targaryen family lost the battle on the continent of Westeros, and lost their throne, and then crossed the Narrow Sea, and fled to the continent of Essos in a hurry, and stood firm on the Andalus plain, in order to make a comeback. The Robert Baratheon, the Kingslayer and the Mountain mentioned by the coach just now are Viserys' enemies. There is a blood feud between the two, and their hands are stained with the blood of the Targaryens. I will, coach. Viserys was silent for a while, and finally nodded, speaking calmly. He knew that the coach was reminding him not to be content with the current stability, and not to forget the blood feud in the past. In the future, I will kill them myself to avenge my father and brother. Although the city of Andalus has been established, the Iron Throne on the other side of the Narrow Sea will not let him go. Viserys has been assassinated countless times in the past few years, including poisoning and assassination, but they were all safely resolved one by one. Although Baratheon suffered a heavy blow 5 years ago, he quickly cheered up, and a new royal fleet was about to be built. It is believed that, although Robert Baratheon was furious, and gave Storm's End to his younger brother Renly as a punishment for Stannis, he still reserved a chance for Stannis to make up for his mistakes. The new royal fleet was still given to Stannis to build and train, with the goal of retaking Dragonstone. However, because the massive amount of gold dragons invested before wasted, the new fleet plan encountered strong opposition from the Prime Minister Jon Arryn. In the end, it was delayed for 2 years, and the Seven Kingdoms were scraped 3 feet from top to bottom, and a new loan was borrowed from the Iron Bank to raise enough funds for the new fleet. And this time Stannis was fully prepared. He would never repeat the same mistake again, and give the Targaryen fleet any chance to attack. It took more than 3 years to build the new royal fleet from the time the first gold dragon was received. The plan to attack Dragonstone was finally put on the agenda. In Andalus, while Viserys, Knight Bessie and Sir William were talking, a castle guard came over. Your Majesty, there is a man who claims to be the governor of Pentos who wants to see you. Chapter 83, Wooden City. Governor of Pentos? The silver-haired boy held his helmet, and was a little surprised when he heard the guard's words. In recent years, they have been developing peacefully on the Andalus plain, and have not interfered with Pentos. Although the two sides are not far apart, there is still the Velvet Mountains as a barrier. Apart from normal business exchanges and civil exchanges, there is almost no high-level dialogue between the two city-states. Viserys did not expect that today. I don't know where the sun came out from, and Pentos actually sent a governor to Andalus. Viserys knew very well that Pentos was theoretically governed by the Prince of Pentos, but in fact, the power of the Prince of Pentos had been hollowed out by the governors a long time ago. Now he only has the function of ceremonial, presiding over meetings and festival banquets. Now Pentos is actually ruled by the governors together. Since your Majesty has important matters to deal with, I will leave first. Sir William spoke hoarsely, while leaning on his cane. Viserys nodded slightly, and then Sir William left the race course. It was time to take medicine today, and he had to find a Maester to mix some soup medicine. The figure of the coach went away, but Bessie still followed Viserys. As Viserys' guard, he naturally had to protect the safety of the little king at any time. Although he was not officially appointed as a King's Guard, because as the younger brother of Jon Darry, the former King's Guard of the Mad King, the coach believed that they were not qualified to be on par with his brother, and now they were even less able to bear the title of King's Guard. However, in addition to the title, Bessie also had the responsibilities equivalent to those of the King's Guard. Viserys pondered for a long time, and then asked again, "Do you know the name of this governor of Pentos?" The guard who came to report thought for a moment after hearing Viserys' question, and then replied respectfully, "Your Majesty, I heard their conversation. The governor of Pentos seems to be called Illyrio Mopatis." Illyrio Mopatis. Viserys felt that the name sounded familiar, and then seemed to remember something, and his lavender eyes narrowed slightly and nodded. "I see. Go and ask this governor to wait in the hall." Understood. The guards received Viserys' order and retreated. Then Viserys led his guards to leave the parade ground. On top of the castle, a brown-haired girl stood in front of the window and looked at Viserys' receding back, then pouted and snorted softly. She seemed to be still angry with Viserys because she wanted to go out of the city to play a few days ago, but was blocked. She just witnessed the lance duel between Viserys and the guard knights. She was shocked to see Viserys' lance suddenly break, and she screamed. She was afraid that something would happen to Viserys. However, it happened in a flash. Unfortunately, it was just a false alarm. The knight named Bessie lost the duel and was knocked off the horse by his brother. The girl patted her chest and breathed a sigh of relief. Because of the small age difference and the attachment they had once depended on each other, Rhaenys actually always regarded Viserys as her brother in her heart. Then she found Viserys riding on a horse with a broken lance in his hand, and raised his head in a strange way, and looked towards the direction of the castle. He seemed to have just heard a girl's exclamation. When Rhaenys saw this scene, she remembered that she seemed to be angry with Viserys, and then hurriedly hid behind the curtains. It was not until Viserys and his servants left here that Rhaenys came out from behind the curtains again. And she was holding a little girl who looked a little timid in her hand, with silver gold hair. The little girl heard the excitement outside the window, then stepped on a small stool, and leaned against the window to look out, but because of her height, she could not see the scenery outside the window. "Okay, Daenerys, don't be naughty. I'll fall you again." Rhaenys found the little girl's dangerous action and quickly took her down from the small stool. Illyrio Mopatis rode in a carriage into the legendary wooden city Andalus. The carriage swayed on the flat road, and then a thick finger with a gem lifted the curtain of the carriage. The fat man sat in the carriage, looking out curiously at this moment. He had a yellow forked beard full of oil and a mouth full of uneven yellow teeth, and a gem ring on each finger. He was Illyrio Mopatis, the wealthy governor of Pentos. Although Pentos was not far from Andalus, it still required traveling overland. Illyrio was a poor assassin in his youth, with a strong body. But now Illyrio has lost the ability to ride a horse because of lack of exercise and serious body shape. Now he feels that his butt is about to be broken after traveling a long way to Andalus in a carriage. "I swear, this is the last time I will ride in a carriage. Abe, come and rub my waist." Illyrio sat in the carriage and looked at the scenery of the wooden city outside the window. At the same time, he ordered the servant beside him. The servant named Abe hurried to the master's side to massage his sore waist and abdomen. Illyrio hummed a few times, adjusted his sitting posture, and continued to look at the scenery outside the window with a little curiosity in his eyes. Andalus was called the Wooden City in rumors outside because the speed of the city's uprooting was extremely amazing. After Viserys Targaryen came to the Andal Plains, he called on all the Andals to gather in the name of the 7 apostles and the king of the Andals, and then built this city. Because they needed to gain a foothold quickly, there were more than tens of thousands of people in the early stage. Even if Targaryen had accumulated a lot of wealth on Dragonstone, he could not withstand such a squandering. For the first time, Viserys learned that mobilizing a large army to fight, even the money and food needed for one day, was an astronomical figure. So when you come to a new city, you must quickly gain a foothold and start production, and try to be self-sufficient. Therefore, Andalus, a city that has risen miraculously and quickly, was built entirely of wood in the early days, and then it was given the name of the City of Wood. However, all this has changed a little in the fire that occurred 2 years ago. A fire that was unknown, whether it was a natural disaster or a man-made disaster, burned 1/5 of the city of Andalus. The number of people burned to death in this fire reached thousands, but the economic loss was not very large. Because although Andalus rose rapidly, its economic level was not high, and there was nothing to burn even in a fire. However, Viserys still learned from his mistakes at that time, slowed down the expansion of the city, started some renovation projects, and gradually demolished some wooden houses, and rebuilt them into stone houses. And it all started with his castle. Chapter 84, Prince of Pentos. Not long after Gilulu, the carriage passed through the entire city and finally drove into the mountain road, paved with bluestone slabs. Illyrio no longer felt the pain in his buttocks here. He had already reached the foot of the castle. The road was extremely flat, and even the carriage could not feel any bumps. Illyrio sat in the carriage, and looked at the simple castle on the hill curiously. The black-bottomed three-headed dragon flag of Targaryen was hung above the castle. As an assassin and mercenary, he could see that the construction idea of this castle was to focus on defense. It was unbreakable, with shooting holes and battlements everywhere. Although this Andalus castle was simple and built with mud, wood and stone, it was located in such a high geographical location with a panoramic view of all directions, and it could still be easily defended and difficult to attack. If you want to capture this castle, although Illyrio has never led a large army, he estimated that at least 2 or 3,000 people would be needed, and half of these 2 or 3,000 people might have to die here. Who is this Viserys Targaryen? Illyrio was very curious about Viserys. As far as he knew, Viserys had only started to gain power after his mother, Queen Rhaella, died, and he was not very old. And he actually achieved such a level, and really built a huge city on a land with no money to be squeezed, which was amazing. Although Illyrio did not understand the double-edged sword of religious belief plus nationalism, he knew that Viserys had spent a lot of money. Can you really buy a city with money? Illyrio's heart moved slightly. Although he was now the governor of Pentos, there were many governors, and it was not as refreshing as being a city lord. But this was just a thought. Illyrio, who could climb all the way from a mercenary assassin to the position of governor of Pentos, was naturally not a fool. He was very self-aware and knew where his abilities were. His management was still a mess, not to mention building a city from scratch. Then, checked the identity of the carriage. Rumble. The gates of Andlusburg opened wide, letting the convoy in. Illyrio's carriage was in the middle of the procession, escorted by 50 soldiers, as well as gifts for Viserys, various gold and silver treasures, Pentos specialty wine, white amber wine, etc., which filled 10 large carriages. The carriages drove into the castle and stopped. Soldiers came forward to load and unload the goods, and brought out several men and women in shackles. These were slaves for Viserys. Although Pentos had clearly prohibited the slave trade, everyone knew that it could not be prohibited, and Illyrio, with the help of the servants, struggled to get off the carriage. My lord governor. At this time, a guard in the castle came over to lead the way for the governor of Pentos. Your majesty is waiting for you in the hall. Illyrio Mopatis, the governor of Pentos, followed the guards into the hall of the castle and sat on a chair. Soon, a maid brought tea. The hall of the castle looked simple but not shabby. Windows were opened on both sides of the wall, and the sunlight shone directly into the hall, making it brighter. 2 rows of carved stone pillars supported the ceiling, and the floor was paved with checkered marble. At the end of the hall, a dark and heavy throne was placed on the steps. On both sides of the throne were 2 sides of exquisitely crafted black and gold brocade. The surface of the satin was embroidered with the Targaryen family's 3-headed dragon emblem on a black background. While Illyrio was looking at the hall, a burst of dense footsteps came from the back of the hall. Your Majesty. The guard's respectful voice. Yes. There was also a calm and steady voice. Then the back door of the hall was opened, and a figure appeared from the 2 passages behind the throne, surrounded by stars. Illyrio put down the teacup in his hand, stood up from the chair, and bowed slightly. Your Majesty. Viserys had just taken off his armor and changed into a more formal outfit. His squaw, Knight Bessie, also took off his armor that had a big hole in it and changed into a lighter, decorative armor, and then followed Viserys. "Sir Governor, please sit down." Viserys sat on his throne, then gestured to Illyrio, and the wealthy governor of Pentos sat back on the chair, which creaked under the weight. Viserys' guard Bessie held the hilt of the sword with one hand and the other hand behind his back, standing behind the throne. "I have heard of your majesty's name a long time ago. I'm honored to meet you this time." Illyrio sat back on the chair and spoke first, looking at the silver-haired boy sitting on the throne. "This is the little Targaryen king, Viserys Targaryen III. When Viserys walked in with his guards just now, Illyrio's eyes really lit up. Although he has normal sexual orientation and likes beautiful women, Viserys' appearance is so handsome that even men can't help but admire him. Viserys' brother Rhaegar once fascinated countless women in the Seven Kingdoms, and Viserys looks 7 points similar to Rhaegar since he was a child. Viserys sat on the throne and heard Illyrio's flattery. His face was as calm as water. He had heard such words countless times and his heart was no longer rippled. Then he nodded slightly. "You are too kind, Governor. Then I wonder what the governor has come to Andalus for this time." Viserys did not continue to beat around the bush with Illyrio, but asked directly. "Of course, I will give his majesty a great gift and make friends with his majesty," Illyrio said confidently while sitting on the chair. "Make friends? How do I make friends?" Viserys raised his eyebrows slightly when he heard what the other party said. "Of course. You have made this friend by accepting the gift." Illyrio laughed heartily. His fat was trembling, and the chair under his butt was also making a wailing sound. "A great gift?" However, Viserys was unmoved and continued to ask. "Of course it is a great gift. Papa." Then the governor of Pentos clapped his hands, and his accompanying slaves came in with a dazzling array of gold, silver and jewelry. "Hi friends, let's discuss." Regarding the previous plot, my original outline wrote that Viserys agreed to the marriage contract with Irion under pressure, which is also the plot of the original book, but the heroine is definitely not Irion. But I was criticized quite badly at that time. I was afraid that everyone would say things like cuckold, poisonous, etc. So I changed it to politely rejecting the marriage proposal. Many friends reacted that it was unreasonable, and I also felt it was unreasonable. I want to change it back to according to the outline. What do you think? Chapter 85 Invitation. As one of the 9 free trade cities, it is not surprising that the governor of Pentos would send gifts to Viserys. Andalus is a newly built city with only 5 years of history, but it has absorbed a large number of Vandals. Now Andalus has a city size of 80,000 people. Although Andalus has not solved the problem of poverty and still has a large number of poor people, its main exports rely on traditional animal husbandry and planting. The vast plains and mild climate are suitable for growing crops and raising livestock. But Andalus has a large population of a single race, and its war potential has grown to a point that cannot be ignored. So Pentos, as a close neighbor, has to be nervous, which led to Illyrio's mission this time. One rises while the other falls. Pentos' strength has long been at the bottom of the 9 free trade cities. The reason is that Pentos once broke out in war with Bravos over the issue of slavery. Bravos asked Pentos to abolish slavery in the name of freedom, but Pentos refused to accept it. Subsequently, 6 wars broke out between the two sides over a period of 200 years, and Bravos won 4 of them. The last one happened 91 years ago. Pentos cut the throats of 4 princes in succession within a year and sacrificed them to the gods, but it still could not change the situation of the war that took a sharp turn for the worse. Bravos' invincible fleet blockaded the port of Pentos, and eventually the governors of Pentos had to sign a humiliating treaty and kneel down to beg for peace. It was publicly announced that slavery was abolished, the slave trade was banned, and the number of warships owned was greatly reduced. Only 20 ships were allowed to be retained, and the rest of the Pentos warships were all sunk into the sea. At the same time, Pentos was not allowed to hire mercenaries, sign contracts with free mercenary groups, or retain any troops beyond the city guard. Since the war 91 years ago, although Pentos has huge walls, it is still generally regarded as the most vulnerable of the free trade cities. It is for this reason that the governors of Pentus maintain a friendly attitude towards other free trade cities, Dothraki horse kings, and all forces around them that may pose a threat to them. Over the years, Pentus has cultivated relationships with a series of powerful cows, giving them gifts and gold and silver to ensure that their cows will not invade Pentus and can provide protection for Pentus at critical moments when they are active east of the Rhine River. Illyrio's mission this time is to establish a friendly and cooperative relationship with the newly built city of Andalus. It is commonly known as making friends, and Pentus' way of making friends is also very unique. Illyrio clapped his hands, and the gold, silver jewelry, various gifts, and fine wine that filled 10 carriages were listed in the hall, including 4 slaves given by Illyrio personally, 2 strong slaves who fought for 5 consecutive victories in the arena, and 2 female slaves with good figures and looks. Viserys was slightly stunned when he sat on the throne, looking at the hall full of gold, silver jewelry, various gifts, and 4 slaves. Although he had long known that Pentus' way of making friends was very special, would this way of throwing money be too contemptuous? Viserys was silent for a long time, looking at everything in front of him, and finally waved his hand. Take it. The construction of Andalus consumed too many gold dragons in the early stage. Although the income and expenditure have been balanced, Viserys saw that the family's wealth in the vault had shrunk by more than half, and naturally he was heartbroken. Based on the principle of saving as much as possible, he could only accept these wealth. As for the 4 slaves, Viserys ordered the guards to tear up their contracts. If they were willing to stay, they would stay in Andalus, and if they were not willing, they would be allowed to leave. Because of the proximity of Bravus, Viserys did not want to make trouble for himself. He once wanted to send a bear in the red VIP to Astapata by the Unsullied to expand the military and protect the city defense, but in the end, due to the pressure from Bravus, he cancelled the purchase order. Bravus, as a city-state built by slaves, opposes all slavery in the world. However, Viserys did not directly refute Illyrio's face. Although the other party was polite, he was still the governor of Pentus who held the power, so Viserys directly accepted these slaves and then dealt with them. When Illyrio saw Viserys accept the gifts, he smiled. Accepting the gifts meant accepting the kindness of Pentus, and his mission was mostly completed. Then the fat governor made a new invitation. Your Majesty, one more thing. Illyrio stood in front of the chair and bowed slightly with his big belly, then spoke. The governors of Pentus have long heard of your great name. I hope to invite you to Pentus as a guest. At the same time, the governors have prepared more generous gifts for you. Viserys as a guest in Pentus? More generous gifts? Viserys frowned slightly while sitting on the throne, then turned his head to look at the servants around him, and Bessie also looked at the little king on the throne, not understanding what the governor of Pentus intended. Since he wanted to give a gift, why didn't he give it directly this time? Why did he have to go to Pentus himself? Could it be dragon eggs? Illyrio, standing in the hall, spoke directly. As expected, Viserys narrowed his beautiful eyes, knowing that Illyrio had dragon eggs in his hands, and only gifts of this level could induce him to leave Andalus and go to Pentus. In fact, Viserys had also wanted to buy dragon eggs in recent years, but dragon eggs were hard like a beautiful stone before they were hatched, and it was difficult for ordinary people to distinguish the real from the fake. I once bought 3 dragon eggs in the Shadowland east of Ashay, although they have become fossils due to the long years. Illyrio stood in the same place and still spoke respectfully. I'm not sure if it can still hatch, but I believe your majesty may be interested in it. Indeed, you are right, Lord Governor. I'm indeed very interested in dragon eggs. Viserys also stood up from the throne, then walked down the steps, and came to Illyrio, looking into the eyes of the wealthy governor in front of him and spoke calmly. Because of his good exercise, the little king's height has once again jumped up, only about a head shorter than Illyrio. Illyrio looked at the little king who was standing in front of him, and felt a little nervous, especially when he was stared at by those lavender eyes. I promise. But then he heard Viserys' calm voice. Your Majesty? Bessie, who was standing behind the throne, was startled when she heard Viserys' words. Chapter 86 Guards. Although Bessie knew that the dragon egg was extremely important to Viserys, they had not figured out Pentus's true purpose yet. How could the young king have such courage to agree to go to the meeting alone? Your Majesty, do you want to reconsider? However, Viserys waved his hand and interrupted what Bessie wanted to say. No problem. It's just a banquet. What's there to consider? I believe in the reputation of the governor. Viserys said calmly. I just need to bring some personal soldiers for protection. Then the young king turned his head and looked at Illyrio and then spoke. How is it, governor? Illyrio stood there and blinked slightly, as if he was a little dazed. He didn't expect Viserys to not even stutter, and immediately agreed to the invitation to Pentos. He thought he might need to spend some more time talking. Is this young king so courageous? Illyrio suddenly felt that Viserys was able to lead the family out of the previous predicament and start the current situation, relying on more than just luck. Although he had no ill will towards Viserys, it was the common will of the other governors to invite the little king to Pentos, and they all wanted to meet the heir of Targaryen. In fact, since Andalus began to rise, the governors of Pentos have set their sights on this newly built small city and observed it carefully. They watched it grow gradually and become a powerful force that is adjacent to Pentos and cannot be ignored. Even on the road to Andalus's rise, there was some small help from Pentos, both overt and covert, which helped the city develop rapidly. And the reason why Pentos did this little trick, except for these governors, perhaps no one could know. Of course. Then the governor of Pentos nodded immediately. Since Viserys agreed, everything would be easy. Your Majesty, please rest assured that Pentos also respects the rights of guests. Murdering guests at a banquet is a heinous crime in Pentos, and even the gods will not forgive it. Illyrio patted his chest and assured Viserys. However, he immediately thought of something and asked, oh, by the way, Your Majesty, how many soldiers did you bring? Viserys had just said that he would bring a little bit of soldiers for protection, but Illyrio saw that there were only 6 or 7 of them, or at most a dozen. He had only brought 50 soldiers with him this long in the carriage. Yes. However, Viserys nodded calmly after hearing Illyrio's words and then spoke. My soldiers are about 4,000. How many? The governor of Pentos almost jumped up when he heard Viserys' words. Was the little king coming to keep an appointment or to attack the city with more than 4,000 people? Although it was impossible for more than 4,000 people to conquer Pentos, it would take at least tens of thousands of elite soldiers and siege weapons to attack a giant city-state like Pentos. However, Viserys leading a large army in person would undoubtedly cause panic among the citizens of Pentos. Seeing the expression on Illyrio's face, Viserys shrugged slightly. The governor doesn't believe it? Then the young man turned to Bessie and asked, Bessie, are my guards 4,000 people? The young knight standing next to the throne held the hilt of the sword with one hand and was slightly relieved after hearing Viserys' next words. It seemed that the little king had not lost his composure. Now Bessie knew that Viserys was very brave and dared to go to Bravos alone when he was young. But what he didn't know was that Viserys was like a frightened rabbit at that time, and he would be frightened pale at the slightest movement. Then Bessie nodded and said while holding the hilt of the sword, Yes, Your Majesty. Your guards do have 4,000 people. This involves the composition of Andalus's military strength. Now the city's standing force for external warfare is more than 4,000 brave and combative Andal warriors, who are all nominally Viserys' guards. The Dragonstone Navy is stationed in a distant port, and the traditional naval forces of the Targaryens are not counted. Excluding the 3,000 or 4,000 sailors and navy of the fleet, more than 4,000 brave and skilled Andal warriors, and the guards who maintain the basic defense of Andalus, there are less than 2,000 people. For a city with a population of only 80,000, it can piece together an army of nearly 10,000 people. The ratio of population to soldiers is 8 to 1, which is already a very amazing number. If it is not compared with nomadic peoples like the Dothraki, it can almost be regarded as a whole nation of soldiers. And Viserys is now going to take away the 4,000 most elite Andal warriors of Andalus and follow him to Pentos to keep the appointment. Your Majesty, aren't more than 4,000 guards a little too many? Illyrio saw that Viserys' face did not seem to be joking, and then this greasy big face wrinkled into a bitter gourd. He understood that Viserys did not want to believe them. Indeed, more than 4,000 people are a bit too many. Viserys stood in front of Illyrio, smacked his lips slightly, and then nodded and spoke casually. Then how about I leave more than 4,000 people outside the city and only bring 100 knights into the city? Of course. Illyrio heard Viserys change his mind and only bring 100 knights into the city. He breathed a sigh of relief and agreed immediately. However, as soon as he said this, the rich merchant governor was stunned. He suddenly felt that he had been fooled. Viserys' original intention might be to bring 100 elite knights into the city, so that even if he encountered danger, he might have some ability to resist. Even with the 4,000 people outside, there is a certain chance to escape from the gate, and he would not be completely captured. Okay. Illyrio smiled bitterly on his fat face. He did not expect Viserys to be not only brave, but also clever. In this case, Pentus will wait for your majesty's arrival. Soon. A few days passed. Beep. The long and desolate horn sounded, and the 4,000 elite Andal warriors of Andalus broke camp and set up camp. Rumble. The horses galloped, the flags fluttered, and the spears raised high reflected the cold light in the sun. The soldiers protected their king on both sides, and marched towards the Velvet Mountain, heading straight for the rich pearl of the bay. Pentus. Chapter 87. Pentus. Hover sea breeze gently caressed his cheeks, and lifted the hair on the boy's forehead. The Andalus army bypassed the Velvet Mountain, and marched along the road that merchants from the two cities of Andalus and Pentus walked along the coast. The army moved forward, and climbed the high hill. Turning back, they could see the endless sea on their right hand side, the soft sand, the gentle sea breeze, and the waves that were rising one after another. Viserys was surrounded by countless soldiers, holding the reins with one hand. He was riding a gentle white mare. Viserys himself had two horses. One was a stronger and more active warhorse, and the other was used for daily travel, and had a more gentle personality, which was the one he was riding now. The little king rode a white horse, wearing a clean and tidy leather armor, a long sword at his waist, a snow-white fur cape, a black and gold-edged cloak with a Targaryen three-headed dragon emblem embroidered on the back, and long silver gold hair spread on the cloak. Hill. The Andalus army soon approached Pentus. The chaotic sound of footsteps and horseshoes intertwined, and the spears raised high became a forest of spears in the sun. Crash. The three-headed fire dragon flag fluttered in the wind. Boom. Then the Andalus army stopped not far from the gate of Pentus, and began to set up camp on the spot. What happened? Has the war broken out? The citizens of Pentus were frightened when they saw the army outside the city approaching. In an instant, there was an uproar and panic, thinking that Pentus had once again erupted in war. Quick. Close the city gate. The defenders of Pentus were relatively calm, and did not panic too much. They held their weapons tightly, and shouted loudly to close the city gate first. Because they had received the news long ago, but even though they were prepared, there was still chaos at the city gate, and they finally closed the gate with great effort. Boom. The gate of Pentus was finally closed. Pentus. Viserys sat on horseback, and looked at this scene with a normal expression, his hair fluttering in the wind. He was also looking up and down at this huge city-state, with tall walls, solid gates, square brick towers, that could be seen from outside the city, and huge red temples and palaces with 9 towers. Pentus was really rich. But what surprised Viserys was that this rich city-state was so afraid of war, like a frightened bird. He only brought 4,000 people, and it was not enough to attack Pentus. But even so, Pentus was so nervous. Could it be that Pentus was really scared by Bravos? Viserys sat on horseback and observed this huge city-state for a while, and then finally retracted his gaze. The 100 knights who were to follow him into the city had already been selected, and at this moment they all rode out of the queue and gathered around him. Illyrio, the wealthy governor of Pentus, ordered the carriage to move forward. He wanted to personally go forward and ask Pentus to open the city gate. It didn't take long for the governor to personally negotiate. Creaky, the gate of Pentus finally opened again, but the gap was not big, only allowing 2 or 3 horses to pass side by side. The defenders hid behind the city gate, holding their weapons tightly and looking out. There was still some tension on their faces. It seemed that, if there was any slight movement, the more than 4,000 people outside who were trying to seize the city would quickly close the city gate. Enter the city. Viserys was not timid when he saw this scene. His black cloak was blown by the whistling sea breeze outside the city gate, and his hair was blocked in front of his eyes. Then the little king waved his hand and urged his warhorse forward. The 100 knights following him also filed in through the narrow city gate and entered the city of Pentus. The horseshoes made a light sound on the bluestone road of this rich city-state. Viserys finally entered the city of Pentus on horseback. He held the reins with one hand and looked at the surrounding scenery with some curiosity. The citizens on both sides of the road in Pentus also looked at this group of uninvited guests from the outside world with some curiosity. 100 knights, all wearing helmets and armor, surrounded and protected the little king. The war horses galloped forward through the prosperous streets of Pentus and headed straight for the palace of the Prince of Pentus. Viserys came to Pentus this time to attend this banquet. Your Majesty. Soon Viserys and his 100 knights arrived in front of the prince's palace. Illyrio accompanied him, and a waiter came to greet him. Viserys turned over and dismounted and handed the warhorse to the servant to take away. The other knights were stationed outside the palace, and Bessie followed Viserys into the palace of Pentus. Your Majesty, this way please. The waiter led Viserys, and Illyrio followed him. He was a little out of breath because he walked too fast, then turned his head to look at the little king and spoke. Welcome to Pentus, Your Majesty. What do you think of Pentus? The Prince of Pentus's palace was extremely spacious and magnificent, with towering carved stone pillars. Maids dressed in simple and revealing clothes shuttled through it. A breeze blew through it and made white eyes charming. The marble floor tiles under his feet and the walls on both sides were covered with exquisite brocade. Viserys walked in the long corridor, looking at the prosperous and magnificent halls around him, and then he retracted his gaze when he heard Illyrio's words. Pentus is indeed very charming. Viserys nodded and said concisely, ha ha ha, of course. Pentus is also honored to gain your friendship. Illyrio laughed heartily, but his words seemed to have a hidden meaning. Viserys heard Illyrio's words, turned his head to look at him, but did not continue the sentence. Chapter 88 Dragon Egg. In fact, Viserys had long known about Pentus's little tricks. This was a conspiracy by the governors of Pentus, who hoped to take this opportunity to alienate the close relationship between Bravus and Andalus. As a buffer zone between Pentus and Bravus, Andalus is now growing stronger and stronger, and will naturally seek ways to get rid of Bravus' influence. And what Pentus hopes is to instigate Andalus to rebel, so that Pentus can also seize the opportunity to stay away from Bravus and tear up the humiliating treaty to become a normal city-state. Pentus thought this would be a perfect cooperation, but Viserys did not want to be the first one to stand out, let alone fall into the trap and die for Pentus. He just wanted to develop quietly, farm peacefully, and seek changes when the time was right. After all, Andalus was a city that rose with the secret support of Bravus, and Andalus's finances also relied on the help of the Iron Bank, and it still owed several low-interest loans from the Iron Bank. But even though Viserys already knew Pentus's tricks, he still had to make this trip for the dragon eggs. After all, these 3 dragon eggs were too important to him. But Viserys also had to consider that, if he got too close to Pentus, it would inevitably affect the cooperative relationship with Bravus. Therefore, Viserys proposed to lead the army at that time, which was equivalent to telling Bravus and everyone that he did not trust Pentus. There was no close connection between the two secretly, but he had to make a trip for the dragon eggs. Soon, Viserys entered the depths of the palace accompanied by Illyrio, and the contemporary Prince of Pentus and the governors had already arrived here. This is from the noble Rodney family, the Prince of Pentus. Illyrio stood beside Viserys and introduced. The Prince of Pentus was selected from 40 noble families, and could not refuse the appointment. The last prince who escaped the appointment formed a mercenary group, and has not been able to return home yet. Viserys raised his head, and looked at the highest point of the hall. It was a throne made of ivory and gold, on which sat a man wearing gorgeous clothes, and with a dull expression. He was the contemporary Prince of Pentus, with the noble surname of Rodney. Beside him were 3 heralds, holding the golden scales symbolizing trade, the steel sword symbolizing war, and the silver whip symbolizing law. Dear guest, welcome. After Illyrio introduced, the Prince of Pentus spoke in a dull voice. Viserys narrowed his eyes slightly, then glanced at his side, and did not speak immediately. At this time, the servant Bessie, who was standing behind the little king, stood up, walked to Viserys' side and introduced loudly. "This is the king of the Andals, the Roiner and the First Men, the legitimate ruler of the 7 kingdoms of Westeros and the protector of the entire realm, the apostle of the 7 gods, the true dragon Viserys Targaryen III." The loud voice of the Night Bessie echoed repeatedly in the spacious hall. Viserys looked at the dull-faced Prince of Pentos, then nodded slightly and spoke, "My lord." After Viserys' voice fell, there was silence in the hall. The Prince of Pentos was like a piece of wood, looking at his nose, mouth and heart, as if he didn't hear Viserys' voice, and didn't say a word. However, the hall was silent for a moment, and then a voice came from the upper right of Viserys, breaking the silence in the hall. "Welcome to Pentos, King Targaryen." Viserys turned his head slightly, and looked in the direction of the voice. A grey-haired old man was sitting on the upper right of the stairs of the hall, wearing a golden medal on his chest. The person who spoke was him. "This is the governor from the Green family," Illyrio introduced in a low voice again. Viserys nodded slightly, and at the same time, his eyes swept around the surrounding environment. There were several chairs placed around the steps of the hall, and each chair was occupied by a governor of Pentos. Some of them were white-haired old men, some were middle-aged men with big bellies like Illyrio, and some were younger. However, their attire was also different. There was even a middle-aged man who had a golden curtain in front of him, only his legs were exposed, and his face was not clearly visible. I wonder if he could see the outside world through the curtain. "Please take a seat, Your Majesty." Then the voice of a governor of Pentos came from the left-hand side of Viserys. This governor looked a little young, probably only about 30 years old. Viserys nodded slightly, and then under the guidance of Illyrio, he also climbed the stairs to the top of the hall next to Illyrio, and sat down. After Illyrio arranged for Viserys to take a seat, he whispered a few words to the servant beside him, and then sat on the chair. Not too long passed. 2 servants carefully carried a heavy box, carried it to the top of the stairs, and then placed it in front of Viserys. Click. Then the servant opened the box with a key, and 3 dragon eggs were neatly placed in the box, and a layer of soft lantern grass was used as a support. "These are the dragon eggs." Viserys' eyes fell on the 3 dragon eggs in the box, and his 5 fingers clenched slightly involuntarily. Even though Viserys was already very good at controlling his emotions, he couldn't help but feel his heartbeat speed up at this time. Then, the little king reached out, and held up a dragon egg, and looked at it carefully. The touch of the dragon egg was a little cold when it first touched it. The surface of the eggshell was covered with tiny scales. The light in the hole shone on the dragon egg, which was as shiny as if it had been polished. They have rich textures and colors. When observed closely, they look like fine ceramics, enamel, or blown glass. However, dragon eggs are much heavier than these things, like a solid stone. Viserys felt that this huge dragon egg was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life. "Your Majesty, since these dragon eggs were purchased by Lord Illyrio, they have been in his hands for so many years without any movement." At this time, the old governor who started the conversation spoke again. "It seems that no one can hatch a dragon, except the descendants of a true dragon. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 89, Balboa Cal. Perhaps so. Viserys held a dragon egg in his hand, slightly tilted his head to look at the governor of Pentos, who spoke not far away, and then spoke in a calm voice. Then he retracted his gaze, and continued to focus on the 3 dragon eggs in his hand. The colors of these 3 dragon eggs are very beautiful. The one he is holding now is dark green, and various bronze spots are revealed as Viserys turns the angle. There are 2 other dragon eggs lying in the box. One of them is a light milky white dragon egg with golden stripes. The last one is black. It seems to be slightly larger than the other 2. The whole body is deep like the midnight ocean, but there are dark red waves and whirlpools. Viserys put down the green dragon egg in his hand, and then turned to hold the last and largest black dragon egg, and the heavy weight pressed on his wrist. "It's beautiful." The 3 dragon eggs were reflected in the boy's lavender eyes, and the heartbeat that had just accelerated also calmed down a little at this time. Then Viserys put down the black dragon egg and put it back into the box, then raised his head and looked at Illyrio beside him and asked, "My lord governor, are there other important guests for this banquet?" Viserys found that the banquet had not started after he arrived. The governors of Pentus were either silent or whispering to him, but no one showed any impatience. "Yes, your majesty." Illyrio turned his head and said when he heard Viserys' words while sitting in his chair, "Do you know the Dothraki?" Viserys nodded slightly. He naturally knew the fierce nomadic people of Dothraki. There is also a Dothraki Khal who accepted this invitation. The Horse King of Dothraki? Who? Viserys frowned slightly when he heard Illyrio's words while sitting in the chair. Suddenly, he had a bad premonition. It can't be such a coincidence. Khal Balbo leads a very powerful Khal. Illyrio explained. "Oh, Khal Balbo." Viserys seemed to have heard this name from the annals before, and then nodded, his frown slightly relaxed. At this moment, there was a chaotic and noisy sound outside the prince's palace, and then several Dothraki with bare chests, painted vests on animal skins, and bronze belts around their waists rushed in. The leader was a tall and strong man with bulging muscles, long black hair tied into a braid and hanging down his back, and a beard with some silver threads mixed in it, and his skin was slightly loose. Behind him were several Dothraki, each with an arc scimitar on his waist. "This is Khal Balbo." Seeing this scene, Illyrio explained in a low voice in Viserys' ear. "Yes." Viserys nodded slightly, but his eyes were fixed on a young Dothraki behind the old Khal. The young Dothraki was taller and stronger than Khal Balbo, with bronze skin, fierce and twisted muscles, and full of explosive power. His face was somewhat similar to the old Khal standing in front of him, with deep black eyes and hair, and a long beard. His hair was braided into a long braid that could make it hang down to his thighs, even longer than Khal Balbo's braid. "He is." Viserys' eyes narrowed slightly. At this time, the Dothraki who had rudely barged in from below was mumbling something he couldn't understand. The Prince of Pentus, who was sitting on the ivory and gold throne, heard the translator talking in his ear, and panic appeared on his stiff face for the first time. The governors of Pentus were also in an uproar, as if they couldn't believe what their respective translators said. Viserys didn't understand Dothraki, so he didn't understand what was going on. But before he could ask, the old Khal below rushed up with his bloodridders. The Prince of Pentus, whose surname was the noble Rodney, seemed to be stunned and at a loss. The 3 heralds standing beside him, who represented trade, war, and law, were also panicked and looked for help at the governors of Pentus around them. However, no one responded to their calls for help. Then Khal Balbo led his bloodridders up the stairs and came to the Prince of Pentus. The old Khal stretched out his hand and directly pulled the prince, who was almost peeing his pants, off the ivory and gold throne. The herald next to him, who was holding a steel sword and symbolizing war, saw this scene and stretched out his hand in a hurry to stop him. Snap, but he was grabbed by the wrist by the young and strong Dothraki standing behind Khal Balbo. The 5 fingers were like steel pliers, and the powerful force almost crushed the herald's wrist bones. Then the young Dothraki's dark and deep eyes slightly glared, and the steel longsword was directly sent into the opponent's chest. Puff, blood spurted out, and the herald screamed, and then the Dothraki loosened his hand, and the herald's body rolled down from the high steps. The blood dyed the golden and luxurious steps red, and the body fell under the steps. The blood quickly flowed out in a large area, and there was no movement. The Prince of Pentus was driven off the throne, and his luxurious clothes were torn a little. The dull expression of the past finally fluctuated, and there was a clear fear. He seemed to think of his destined fate in the future. A person huddled in a corner on the upper floor of the hall, and an unknown yellow liquid dripped from his crotch. The other 2 heralds who were driven away had already turned pale with fear after seeing the tragic death of the herald who symbolized the war. They pulled the prince who was hiding in the corner, and seemed to want to take him away. However, Prince Rodney huddled in the corner and refused to leave, even if 2 people pulled him. The old Khal who drove away the Prince of Pentus sat on the throne without any courtesy and then said a few words to the translator, who had been frightened. The translator understood the Dothraki language and hurriedly asked the servants to bring another chair and put it next to the ivory and gold throne and asked the young Dothraki who had been following the old Cal to sit next to him. Chapter 90 Drogo. This is my son, Drogo. Cal Bab sat carelessly on the ivory and gold throne, his braids with a few grey hairs hanging down his back, and his light brown eyes swept over everyone present. Then he patted his son Drogo on the shoulder and proudly introduced him in Dothraki. He is the greatest horseman in the world, and the Cal destined to lead the Cals in the future. The old Cal's blood guards stood behind him with their axe on their waists, staring fiercely at the governors of Pentos around them, including the little King Viserys not far away. The son of the Cal named Drogo sat next to his father, wiping the blood off his hands with a luxurious silk that had just been placed on the table of the Prince of Pentos. Drogo seemed a little taciturn, but he had no hesitation when he killed the Herald of War, just as easily as killing a chicken. Then Drogo heard his father's voice, raised his head slightly, and made a dull sound of HMM without saying anything more. His dark and deep eyes looked around at everyone present, only lingered on Viserys for a while, and then turned to other places. The taciturn son of the Cal was not targeting Viserys, but Drogo found that he didn't seem to be very old, and was a little surprised that a teenager would appear in such a high-level banquet. The hall was silent, with only some whispers. The translators who were proficient in Dothraki translated the words of the Horse King to their respective masters, and all the governors looked at each other, not knowing what to say. Viserys didn't have a translator, so he didn't understand what Cal Bulbo was saying. He just sat quietly in his seat, looking at everyone present with a scrutinizing look. He felt that this banquet was becoming more and more interesting, and there was a new discovery every second. At first, Viserys was a little surprised at the barbarity and rudeness of the Dothraki people, shouting in the gorgeous hall. However, until he watched the old Cal lead his bloodridders to rush up the stairs, Viserys' thoughts were refreshed again, and he was surprised at the weakness of Pentos. Then the good show did not stop. Every minute and every second, there were surprising discoveries. The Prince of Pentos was frightened by the Horse King and peed his pants. He was driven off the throne and huddled in the corner. The herald holding the steel sword, symbolizing the war, was killed by the young Dothraki man who looked a little scary, and his body was thrown down the stairs. The governors of Pentos present were terrified, and they all wanted to shrink their heads into their necks. No one dared to speak. Viserys was the one who stood the straightest among all the adults present. These strong and exciting scenes made Viserys feel shocked beyond words. Pentos is so weak. Viserys never thought that a few Dothraki could shit on the necks of the governors of Pentos. Although the Prince of Pentos was just a symbolic puppet. After all, as the nominal owner of the city-state, these governors did not even say a word when they were humiliated by the Dothraki. And this is still in Pentos, their own little piece of land. Viserys led 4,000 elite Andal warriors to Pentos, and Pentos was in a panic and couldn't even close the city gates. However, at that time, Viserys still had a little awe for this ancient city-state. After all, the tall city walls and magnificent buildings all showed the profound and long history of Pentos. Although Andalus rose miraculously and quickly, it was still far from a giant city-state like Pentos, whether in terms of historical heritage, population, economy or military. Although it seems that Pentos can't even gather an army of 10,000 people, it is because of the restrictions of the humiliating terms that Pentos still has a strong potential for war. Now, the last bit of awe that Viserys had in his heart not long ago disappeared, and he was left to watch the farce in front of him with cold eyes, and even had some activities in his heart. Then, Viserys heard Cal Balb mutter something in Dothraki, and then patted the young Dothraki next to him. The Dothraki who had been noticed by Viserys for a long time raised his head and looked around. Everyone rolled their throats when facing the son of the Cal, and then hurriedly lowered their heads, and dared not look directly into the other's eyes. His eyes lingered on Viserys for a while, and the little king happened to be looking at him at that time. The two people looked at each other. The dark and deep eyes were calm, as if they were examining a piece of prey. However, Viserys felt a strong sense of crisis from his scalp to his heels, like an instinctive early warning mechanism of a creature, which issued a strong warning when facing a beast that could threaten his life, telling him to stay away quickly. This guy. The young man frowned slightly, and the 5 fingers on the table could not help but clenched. However, Drogo's eyes only stayed on Viserys for a second, and then the two people's eyes staggered. Balbok Cal just said that the man was his son, named Drogo. What is the best horseman in the world? At this time, Illyrio, who was sitting next to Viserys, watched the farce that just happened, but also watched coldly, without any change on his face, and then whispered in Viserys' ear. Illyrio did not bring a translator, and he seemed to understand Dothraki by himself. Yeah. Viserys nodded slightly, then he was stunned for a moment, and then turned his head to look at the rich merchant governor beside him. Mr. Governor, what did you say was the name of Cal Bulbo's son? Illyrio was stunned for a moment, then explained again. Drogo. Drogo? Viserys sat in his chair for a long time, blinked, and then took a deep breath. In fact, suddenly facing the murderer who killed him in the original trajectory, he thought he would be afraid and panic. After all, few people can face their own life and death calmly, especially the murderer who killed them. However, the reality is, Viserys tried to feel it, and found that he didn't seem to have such emotions in his heart. He just suddenly felt fate. Wonderful. Chapter 91 Mansion. Illyrio didn't know what Viserys was thinking, but he noticed that the young king's expression changed slightly after hearing the name of Drogo, the son of Cal Balbo, as if he had heard the name somewhere before. The old Cal is trying to build momentum for his son. Cal Balbo sat on the ivory and gold throne, raised his wine glass high, and still spoke words that Viserys couldn't understand. The other governors of Pentos, including Illyrio and Viserys, also raised their glasses and drank them all. But Viserys didn't drink. His cup was filled with milk, because he knew that he was not suitable for drinking at his age, and drinking milk would help his body develop and supplement protein. He would never have the opportunity to develop again in the future. Illyrio sat next to Viserys and continued to explain in a low voice. The other governors were all terrified by the Horse King. Only Illyrio attached more importance to communicating with Viserys. Building momentum. Viserys held his wine glass in his hand and turned to look at Illyrio, and Illyrio patiently explained. Each Cal is composed of several Cas. Each Cas is led by a core, and the Cal is the bravest warrior in the entire tribe. But Cal Balbo is old. In fact, few Cals have a good end in the end. Illyrio and Viserys exchanged in a low voice, but his last sentence was meaningful. Now, the whole banquet has begun under the order of the old Cal, and even the absence of the Prince of Pentos does not affect the continuation of the banquet. Not far away, Cal Balbo continued to raise his wine glass, and the governors of Pentos kept flattering him. Illyrio watched coldly, and then continued to speak. If someone challenges the old Cal now, it means that he is no longer the bravest warrior in the tribe, and cannot lead the entire Cal. Cal Balb cannot refuse the challenge. And he is indeed old now, and has lost his confidence. He is afraid that he will die in the challenge, and he is even more afraid that after his death, Drogo will not be able to inherit the position of Cal. So that's it. Viserys nodded slightly, after listening to Illyrio's words. So, Cal Balb really doesn't have a few years to live. But his worries are unnecessary. His son Drogo has never lost a battle since he was born, so he naturally has the upper hand in the competition for Cals. And in the future, he will lead his Cal to become the most powerful tribe in the entire Dothraki Sea. Although one person died, and the Prince of Pentos was driven off the throne and humiliated, the banquet was still held very successfully. The guests participating in the banquet were all drunk, including the old Cal himself, but his blood guards and his son Drogo were extremely sober, and watched these people coldly. When the banquet was about to end, Illyrio told Viserys that the governors had given him a gift. After that, when the guests had dispersed, Viserys walked out of the prince's palace. Outside, 100 Dandel warriors were still waiting in an orderly manner. On the other side, some Dothraki also gathered together, bare-chested, and sat carelessly on the steps in front of the prince's palace. Fortunately, the two groups did not conflict. Although these Dothraki looked down on warriors wearing armor and thought it was a cowardly act, they were not fools. When they had no war horses to accompany them, they also knew that these more disciplined Iron Cans were not easy to mess with. Even if there were more Dothraki, if they really fought on foot, it would be a one-sided battle. Let's go. After Viserys walked out of the palace, He took the reins of his warhorse from the servant, then climbed on the horse and sat on the horse's back. Then he waved his hand, and 100 knights who followed him and also got on their horses. On the other side, the Dothraki who were sitting on the steps laughing and making a lot of noise didn't say much when they saw the group of tin cans leaving. Then their horse king and blood guards also came out, but the cow looked a little drunk. The sound of horse hooves was noisy, and Viserys led the knights away from here. Not far away, Drogo, who was supporting his father, once again glanced at Viserys' back, and his deep black eyes were still calm. "What's wrong, Drogo?" And one of Khal Bolbo's blood guards, a man who had held Drogo when he was a child, keenly noticed that he was paying attention to the boy. He is the exiled Targaryen king, and now the Lord of Andalus. The blood guard of this Khal knew the information about Viserys, but he just heard it at the banquet, and didn't even understand what the Targaryen Wandering King was, but he only knew Andalus. "It's okay." However, Drogo just shook his head. His voice was muddy, but still concise. At first, he just thought that Viserys was not old enough, so he glanced at him, and then the two of them happened to look at each other. Drogo felt that the silver-haired boy's gaze made him feel a little complicated, as if he knew him. Then Drogo accompanied his father, and he found that Viserys looked at him a few more times. The man with long braids was supporting his father at this moment, and then raised his hand and touched his cheek slightly. Then he felt a little cold on his back for the first time. However, this feeling made him extremely uncomfortable. He moved his neck slightly and then clenched his fists tightly, and his joints made a cracking sound. He felt that he would see this guy again in the future, that is, when he became a Khal and plundered Andalus. On the other side, Viserys didn't know that, because he looked at Drogo a few more times. He was targeted by this guy who was good at imagining and holding grudges. The other party even wanted to lead an army to plunder Andalus after inheriting the Khals one day. But for the Dothraki, plundering is their life, just like eating and drinking. It is not surprising that they target anyone. And Viserys is now leading his knights to the east of Pentos. It is near the giant red temple that can be seen from any corner of the city. Illyrio told him that the governors of Pentos also gave him another gift. Beep. The warhorse under Viserys' crotch made a restless sound of the whistle and the horse's hooves stepped lightly. In front of him was a large courtyard, towering brick walls, a spacious and gorgeous gate, a rockery or 3-story house, and one wall was covered with ivy. "This is a gift from the governors to Viserys. A gorgeous mansion in the city of Pentos. Open the door." Then Viserys turned over and got off the horse, and then spoke to the servant at the door. Chapter 92, A Place of Right and Wrong. "Master, Master." The servants along the way saluted respectfully. This mansion was undoubtedly once again filled with some gold and silver treasures, and there were a large number of servants, hot spring baths, 3-story buildings, waterside pavilions, and from the highest sun terrace, you can overlook the rockery and water garden below. Viserys was standing on the highest terrace at the moment, looking at the scenery below. There was no light in the whole courtyard, only the quiet sound of water and the sound of servants moving boxes. The young man pressed the hilt of the sword with one hand. He was wearing strict leather armor. Behind the snow-white plush shawl was a dark cloak, which swayed slightly in the wind. Behind him stood his servants. "Your Majesty, I don't think Pentos has any good intentions." Bessie stood behind Viserys and accompanied him quietly without saying a word, and finally couldn't help but speak. In fact, even the little king himself had some doubts. Originally, Viserys thought that Pentos invited him this time and gave him precious dragon eggs and would also make some corresponding requests. However, in fact, the governors of Pentos did not do so. They did not mention any request and even invited a Dothraki horse king to come and then held a banquet of the highest standard with delicious food, good hospitality, and a large number of gifts. What exactly does Pentos want to do? Viserys himself was a little confused. He was standing on the 3rd floor terrace of the mansion just now, looking at the scenery below, and was actually thinking about the whole problem. Pentos' current behavior made him think of an illusion. Could it be that Pentos wanted to indulge himself in the mansion, treasures, wine, and women, and then not want to return to Andalus to live a hard life? After Bessie finished speaking, Viserys still stood there for a long time without saying anything. The servant was a little flustered in his heart, thinking that he had said something wrong. However, he saw Viserys, who was standing in front of him with only a back view, raised his head again, as if he had finally figured something out. Then he slightly tilted his head to look at the knight standing behind him, and spoke in a calm voice. "You are right, Bessie. Pentis does not have good intentions." The bright moonlight above his head stretched the boys back on the terrace, his silver gold hair fluttering slightly in the wind. "We should not stay here for long. Use them to speed up, and leave here as soon as they are done, and set off back to Andalus." Viserys did not turn around but spoke calmly. "Understood." The squire with dark cheeks was slightly excited when he heard Viserys affirm his point of view. But at the same time, he did not know what the little king meant by Pentis should not be stayed for long, and Viserys did not explain too much. Then the tension in his heart was raised again, and he hurried down to tell the servants and knights to hurry up and take the treasure and prepare to leave soon. It was late at night. Viserys and his knights had packed all the things, including the most important 3 dragon eggs. Then he led everyone straight to the north gate of Pentis. Tap tap tap. Midnight. The crisp and chaotic sound of horse hooves rang out on the spacious Bluestone Road in Pentis. Viserys rushed to the north gate of the city and asked to open the gates to leave. Open the gate. At this time, there seemed to be a noisy sound coming from the huge 9-towered palace in the distance, and there was a faint fire. Viserys sat on the horse and turned his head slightly to look in the direction of the 9-towered palace. He had just led the soldiers in the chaos and seemed to have heard the news that Cal Balbo had been challenged and killed. Now these Dothraki who entered Pentis seemed to be fighting for the position of the new Cal. The blood guards of the old Cal would do their best to avenge him and then commit suicide. The Cals who led the Cals of the entire Cal were also the main candidates for the position of the Cal, and they had people in their hands. Viserys had heard that there were tens of thousands of Dothraki in the east of Pentis who followed the old Cal and were now waiting outside the city, but in a different direction from the Andal warriors, so they did not encounter them. The son of the old Cal, Drogo, is also the main candidate for the Cal. Viserys doesn't really care about the battle for the position of Cal. He doesn't know whether Drogo can successfully seize the position of Cal with him under his wings. What he is thinking about now is the news of the sudden death of the old Cal. He just heard in the chaos that a Dothraki suddenly stood up and challenged the old Cal and then successfully killed him. However, Viserys felt that there was a strong smell of conspiracy. Maybe it was related to Pentis, or maybe it was not related to Pentis. But accepting the invitation to come here for the banquet was the only time that Cal Balbo left the protection of his army. Otherwise, not everyone can see the Cal who stays in the Cals and is protected by countless horsemen on weekdays and take the initiative to challenge him. Although according to the tradition of the Dothraki, the Cal who leads the Cals cannot refuse the challenge of his tribe. But if there are always Dothraki challenging his Cal, wouldn't the Cal be exhausted to death? However, Viserys had no time to think about it at the moment. There were still tens of thousands of Dothraki outside. They were like a huge time bomb that could explode at any time and affect the surrounding fish. If they knew that their Cals were dead and that each Cal had received orders from their Cals, God knows what would happen. Viserys had the token of Illyrio, the governor of Pentis, in his hand, so he could naturally ask to open the gate and leave the city. Moreover, the soldiers did not dare to provoke these more than 100 iron cans, and then opened the city gate for Viserys. Go. Viserys urged his horse to rush out of the gate of Pentis first, and the 100 knights who followed closely behind him also rushed out. Then Viserys came to the place where the Andalus army was stationed, and ordered all the soldiers who had rested for most of the day to break camp and leave this place that was about to become a place of trouble. It was late at night. Viserys was blowing the sea breeze outside the city. The night wind was very cool, and then it got into his clothes. The young king tightened his collar slightly. Trample. Then the white horse stepped onto the hill easily and turned its head. Viserys immediately stood on the hill, watching the soldiers below packing up and preparing to leave, and at the same time, raised his head to look into the distance. There was a commotion in the east of Pentis. The tens of thousands of Dothraki outside Pentis seemed to have known the news of the Cal's death. In the city of Pentis, a blazing fire was reflected in the boy's lavender eyes. Then he turned his horse's head again. Go. Chapter 93 Going Home. Additional update. Viserys led the army out of Pentus. After a night, the sky finally turned pale. The fire in Pentus was finally put out, and the battle between the Khals seemed to have come to an end. In the morning, the gates of Pentus were finally opened. The frightened citizens of Pentus mustered up the courage to walk out of their homes. The air was full of stench and burnt smells. The Valyrian road leading directly to Norvus in the east of Pentus was now full of corpses. This was a feast for scavengers. Then a group of vultures swooped down from the sky, wanting to share this feast, but they were driven away by the Dothraki who survived this catastrophe. The group of scavengers kept circling in the sky and made a shrill cry. Last night, this powerful Khal was torn apart with the death of Khal Bolbo. Several corps led by their own Khals and the tribesmen led by Drogo who were still loyal to their fathers, started a fierce fight, competing for the position of Khal according to the ancient tradition of the Dothraki. However, at the same time, Takars escaped from the melee, and they did not want their tribesmen to be involved in this cruel meat grinder. Therefore, the Takars, led by their own corps, broke away from the Khals and set off to return to the prairie overnight, preparing to form a new tribe with other Khals or join other Khals. The result of this Khal battle was that Drogo, the son of Khal Balb, became the only living contender for the position of Khal. The leaders of several other Khals were killed by Drogo himself. In the cruel tradition of the Dothraki, there is no other option for failure except death. Drogo killed all his competitors with his own hands, reorganized the remnants left by his father, and became Khal Drogo. A night of chaos. The once powerful Khals had been shattered, and only 1/10 of them remained. However, Khal Drogo was not in a hurry to leave Pentus. He returned to his hometown and found a place without other Khals to quietly lick his wounds. Instead, he led the newly integrated and broken Khals to the north of Pentus with great momentum, seemingly wanting to plunder Andalus' army to make up for the losses last night. However, when Khal Drogo and his Khals arrived here, they learned that Viserys and Andalus' army had already moved their camp and left here last night. Although the Dothraki were a nation on horseback and came and went like the wind, even if they started chasing now, they might be able to catch up with Andalus' army. But after some thought, Drogo, who had just become a Khal, finally gave up the idea of leading his army to continue the pursuit. Now, the Khals left by his father, which had tens of thousands of soldiers, only had more than 3,000 soldiers left after a night of brutal fighting. Some died and some ran away. Khal Drogo's people were not as many as those in the hands of the Little King. Moreover, his Khals had just gone through a night of fighting, and then they had to run a long distance to chase the powerful Andalus army. Although Khal Drogo was very confident in his morale and fighting power, he had to consider the problem of failure and loss, not to mention how likely he was to win this war. Even if he won, he would really be a Khal alone. Therefore, Khal Drogo had to give up the idea of plundering Andalus. He had originally wanted to recover some losses through this surprise raid. Sitting on an extremely strong and hairy black man horse, Khal Drogo's eyes were deep. His shoulders were still wrapped in bandages, and blood was faintly seeping out. This was the wound he got in the melee last night. Then he swung the whip in the air fiercely. Snap, there was a thunderous sound, and then he turned the horse's head and shouted in the turbid and rough Dothraki language. Go home. The newly formed Khals suddenly erupted in deafening cheers. Roar, roar, roar. The Dothraki warriors rode on horseback, holding up their axe and cheering in celebration. Dothraki people generally have no home and go wherever they go, and what they call going home naturally means returning to their hometown, the vast Dothraki sea grassland. And after a period of time, the army led by the young king set out overnight to return to Andalus, and then finally saw the shadow of this city without walls. Rumble, the gate of the castle opened. Viserys had just returned to the castle and removed his gear. He didn't even have time to take a hot bath, and Renessus came with Daenerys. Brother, you are finally back. The girl with long brown hair pulled a little girl and broke into Viserys' bedroom. Viserys had just taken off his coat at this moment, and his soft hair fell on the well-proportioned muscle lines on his back. Hearing the voice behind him, he tilted his head slightly, revealing the perfect facial lines under the silver hair. Viserys doesn't look very strong, just a well-proportioned figure, without big muscles and even a little thin. However, He was able to burst out with great strength, directly flipping Bessie off the horse to the ground, and his legs clamped tightly around the horse's belly, and his upper body did not shake at all. This strong core strength is indeed enviable. The girl rushed in and saw Viserys changing clothes, and her face inadvertently blushed, but she still showed a look of disgust. Rhaenys, I've told you several times. Who told you not to knock on the door? Viserys turned his back to Rhaenys, then found a clean and tidy top and put it on, then turned around and looked at the girl behind him and spoke calmly. TSK, it's not like you haven't seen it before. Why are you hiding it? When Rhaenys heard Viserys start to lecture her again, she pouted slightly. The members of the Targaryen family had a lot of bad luck. After Queen Rhaella died, Viserys and Rhaenys depended on each other. The two of them even had to raise a smaller kid together, just like they were raising their own daughter. Rhaenys also grew up quickly in the process, taking care of her aunt who was younger than her. Because she didn't trust the servants to do it, Rhaenys also had to change her aunt's diapers, teach her how to walk, how to talk, how to wipe her own butt, and how to dress herself. While the two were talking, little Daenerys, who was being held by Rhaenys' hand, wanted to say something several times but stopped herself. Then she finally couldn't help it, and timidly raised her little hand to protest. Hey, Rhaenys, he is my brother, not your brother. Thanks to Xixioli Khan for the 10,000 point reward. Chapter 94 Dragon. After hearing Daenerys' timid words, Viserys and Rhaenys looked at each other, and then smiled at the same time. Oh, yes, it's your brother. The brown-haired girl squatted down, and rubbed her little aunt's cheek, until it was a little red. The little girl struggled hard, and finally escaped from Rhaenys' clutches, ran to Viserys' side, and hid behind him. Brother, Rhaenys bullied me. Daenerys seemed to have found a backer, hiding behind him, and grabbing the corner of the boy's clothes. Her little face was a little red and hot from being rubbed, and now her cheeks were puffed up, and then she accused Rhaenys indignantly. Viserys couldn't help but smile a little when he saw this warm scene, then bent down and rubbed the little girl's soft hair and held her to his side. Then he raised his head and spoke. I want to give you a gift. What? As soon as they heard that Viserys was going to give them a gift, the two girls' attention immediately shifted to him, looking at him expectantly. Dragon eggs. What? Rhaenys was a little bit incredulous, thinking that she had heard it wrong. Dragon eggs? She was not a little girl like Daenerys who knew nothing. She naturally knew what dragon eggs were, and also knew the fate of her family now. And dragons were something that was closely intertwined with the fate of the family. Really? You went to Pentos this time just for dragon eggs? The brown-haired girl's face was full of disbelief. In fact, Viserys did not tell Rhaenys the real purpose of this trip in advance, because he was afraid that she would worry, but Viserys has now returned successfully and obtained the dragon eggs. The angry little girl hiding behind Viserys heard the name dragon eggs, and her beautiful purple eyes also flashed with brilliance. One of her little hands grabbed the corner of the boy's clothes and pulled it, then stuck her head out. Brother, can dragons be hatched from dragon eggs? Viserys felt the corner of his clothes being pulled, then lowered his head to hear the little girl's question, but did not answer her immediately. After being shocked, Rhaenys also raised her delicate chin and looked at Viserys. She also wanted to know the answer. Dragon eggs. Can dragons be hatched? Facing the expectant eyes of the two girls, the silver-haired boy stared at an ancient black wooden box and was slightly absent-minded, but finally nodded. Maybe there is a chance. Rhaenys, Daenerys. Although these 3 dragon eggs have been fossilized for who knows how many years, I believe that, if you incubate them with your heart, you may really be able to hatch dragon babies. After Viserys came to his senses, he raised his head and spoke calmly. At the same time, he looked more at his sister Daenerys, who was hiding behind him, and looking forward to the dragon eggs. Because these 3 dragon eggs were hatched by his sister in the future, and became the mother of dragons. However, fate has changed in this life. Viserys doesn't know if Daenerys can still have that magical power. True dragon blood. Now Viserys, Rhaenys, and Daenerys all have Targaryen blood. Among them, Viserys and Daenerys' blood is purer, and the obvious characteristics of Illyrians can be seen from their appearance. Rhaenys has half of Dawn's blood, brown hair, black eyes, and Targaryen's characteristics are not obvious. The conditions for hatching a dragon are actually very harsh. Viserys knows that it requires fire, life exchange, and the blood of a real dragon. Viserys is not sure whether the Targaryen blood in himself and Rhaenys can be called true dragon blood, but there is no doubt that Daenerys' blood power seems to be more abundant. Wow, I want to hatch a baby dragon. Sure enough, the two girls were excited when they heard that the dragon eggs were likely to be hatched. Then Viserys used the key to open the box with 3 dragon eggs on the table. Click, then the lid was opened, revealing 3 huge dragon eggs protected by lantern grass, each of which was heavy and substantial. These are dragon eggs. The sunlight outside the window poured in. Viserys' eyes fell on the 3 dragon eggs. For some reason, every time he saw dragon eggs, he couldn't help but feel a surge of emotion. So beautiful. The brown-haired girl's eyes were also attracted at once, and she even looked at the 3 beautiful dragon eggs a little blankly, as if she had seen the most beautiful thing in the world. Brother, I want to see it too. Daenerys is behind Viserys, and because of her height, she couldn't see what was on the table. Then she pulled the corner of her brother's clothes, and was picked up by Viserys, and placed on the chair, and then she saw the dragon eggs in the box. When Daenerys and Rhaenys saw these 3 dragon eggs, they were like a magnet that firmly attracted their eyes here. Perhaps they had the same feeling as Viserys, and the Targaryen bloodline might have a unique connection with dragon eggs. In the past few years, Viserys spent a lot of money to buy dragon eggs, but many swindlers who used dyed stones to pretend to be good were identified by Viserys at a glance. Rhaenys, Daenerys. Pick one each. Then Viserys was silent for a moment and looked away from the dragon eggs, looking at the 2 girls who were stunned. This was Viserys' plan, to let 3 Targaryens, including himself, try to hatch these 3 dragon eggs together. He remembered what his magic and mystic consultant Lady Mary once said. When the glass candles burn again, the ghost grass grows again, the dragon flame burns the earth. The phantom turtles haunt the wizard's avenue, the blind regain their sight, and those who have humiliated wizards are cursed. All these signs represent the return of magic, and the power of magic is likely to be revived again. Obviously, dragons and magic have a close connection. But now the front wave of the magic tide has not arrived, and the witch has no power. Can dragons really be hatched in this era without magic? This made Viserys think of the Targaryen family history that he had already read. The last dragon of Targaryen was as thin as a human cub. Was it because of the conspiracy of the Citadel, or was it because the poor little dragon happened to be born at the end of the magic tide that he had such an unfair fate? So, if he was born a few decades earlier, would he also become a hegemon that dominated the sky? Chapter 95 Name. Viserys has no answer to this question yet. He is not sure about the connection between dragons and magic tides. He has relaxed the restrictions, and the 2 girls, Rhaenys and Daenerys, can choose the dragon eggs they like. However, he did not expect that the 2 girls would choose them in an instant. I want this one. I want this one. The brown-haired girl and the little girl with silver gold hair said almost at the same time, pointing to the pale milky white dragon egg with golden stripes, which lay quietly next to the largest black dragon egg. Hey, Daenerys, I said it first. Rhaenys did not expect Daenerys to make the same choice as her. The 2 girls said it almost at the same time, and it was really hard to tell whether Rhaenys was one step faster. However, what people did not expect was that Daenerys, who was usually quiet and ladylike, went up and hugged the pale milky white dragon egg and refused to give it to Rhaenys. No, I said it first. The little girl with silver hair held the dragon egg tightly, and at the same time, she was still stubborn but very angry. You're cheating. Rhaenys was furious when she saw Daenerys cheating. She never expected that her aunt, who had always been very well behaved, would suddenly cheat at this time. Humph, you're cheating. And no matter what Daenerys said, she refused to let go of the pale milky white dragon egg in her hand. At the same time, she was imitating Rhaenys' words to mock her. You. Rhaenys was so angry that she was speechless when she heard Daenerys repeating her words. She widened her beautiful eyes and didn't know what to say. Then the brown-haired girl collapsed. She saw Daenerys put on a look of I'm a rogue, but you can't do anything to me, and she was so angry that she even wanted to scratch the wall. However, Renus really couldn't do anything to Daenerys. After all, she was her aunt. Viserys. She's cheating. Feeling that she had been greatly wronged, Renus looked to Viserys for help, hoping that he could uphold justice for her. Seeing that Renus, who was always lively and a troublemaker in the castle, was defeated by Daenerys, Viserys was a little surprised, and then he couldn't help but smile. Why do you all want this white dragon egg? Viserys was a little curious about why they all liked this pale milky white dragon egg. Because it looks good. Then the two girls said in unison again, and Viserys stood there and blinked slightly. Viserys didn't expect the girls' reason for choosing the dragon egg to be so simple. He originally thought that Renus and Daenerys found something on this pale milky white dragon egg that he didn't notice. Since Daenerys likes it, why don't you give it to her? Viserys began to mediate between the two girls. It was not easy to do the work of a child, so Viserys could only seek a breakthrough from the slightly older Renus. TSK. Renus didn't really have to take the pale milky white dragon egg. And she didn't really want to compete with a little girl for something, but she was just a little angry. Who is not a child? The brown-haired girl pouted slightly, but finally agreed, and gave the pale milky white dragon egg to Daenerys. Okay, then I want this one. Then, Renus pointed her finger at the dark green dragon egg, which could be revealed by a slight rotation of various bronze spots, with an ancient and desolate atmosphere. Daenerys picked the pale milky white dragon egg, Renus took the dark green dragon egg, and the last and largest black dragon egg, like a midnight ocean, was left at the end, left to Viserys. Why didn't anyone choose it? Viserys was a little surprised that neither Renus nor Daenerys chose the obviously largest black dragon egg. This dragon egg was dark and deep, and even had faintly vibrant dark red waves and whirlpools. Even if it was for appearance, this black dragon egg was no worse than the pale milky white dragon egg. Renus tried hard to hold the dark green dragon egg in her arms, but failed. The dragon egg was like a solid stone, really heavy, but Daenerys still held her dragon egg tightly, and refused to let go. Although Daenerys was young, she was very smart, and knew Renus too well. Daenerys knew that, as long as she dared to let go, Renus would immediately change her face and grab it in the next second. And secretly seeing that Daenerys was still holding the dragon egg and refused to let go, Renus glanced at it several times, but didn't get the chance, and finally could only pout and give up helplessly. HMPH. Then Renus heard Viserys' question, looked at him and snorted softly, as if she was still dissatisfied with what had just happened, but she still explained. Because you need it more than us. Viserys. This was the only tacit understanding between her and Daenerys. Both girls saw that the black dragon egg had greater potential and was more beautiful, but Daenerys and Renus both left this dragon egg to Viserys because they knew that Viserys needed it more than them. Is that so? Viserys was slightly stunned when he heard Renus's answer. Then he turned his head and looked at the expression on Daenerys' face, and he saw the same result. Finally, he pursed his lips, was silent for a while, and then nodded. Viserys did not continue to entangle on this topic, and then spoke. If they can hatch, what names do you want to give them? Viserys took the initiative to change the topic just now, perhaps because he was not good at being hypocritical. And the game of power he was in did not allow him to be too hypocritical. Regal. This time, Renus was the first to answer the question. It seemed that she had already had an answer in her heart. Regal? Viserys tilted his head slightly. He saw the sadness in the eyes of the brown-haired girl and understood instantly. Renus named her dragon egg Regal in memory of her father, Rhaegar Targaryen, who was also Viserys' eldest brother. Daenerys, on the other hand, was a little entangled. She thought about her mother whom she had never met, and her father who had heard of his evil deeds. Then, after struggling for a while, she finally came up with a name. Viserion. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 96 Fleet. Daenerys and Renus both gave their dragon eggs the most appropriate names. Renus wanted to commemorate her father Rhaegar, so she named him Regal, while Daenerys had never seen her parents and elder brother, Since she was born, Viserys was everything to her, so the little girl named her dragon egg Viserion. What do you plan to name your dragon egg? The older of the two girls looked at the dark dragon egg, then raised her head and asked curiously. Hearing this question, Viserys pondered for a moment. He didn't know if it was a coincidence that the white dragon Viserion and the green dragon Rhaegal happened to be called this name, but Viserys' black dragon was not going to be called Drogon. If it can hatch. Viserys nodded slightly, then hesitated. I plan to name it Balerion. At this time, meow. Rhaenys' little black cat happened to pass by the window. It heard Viserys' voice and turned its head slightly puzzled. It thought Viserys was calling it. The atmosphere in the room stagnated for a second. Then, ha 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 ha. I'm talking to you, brother. Why did you give your dragon egg a cat's name? The brown-haired girl couldn't help but burst into laughter without any image. She laughed so hard that tears fell down, and Viserys' face suddenly darkened slightly. Rhaenys, go back and copy the family history. In fact, Rhaenys knew that Balerion was not just the name of a cat. Balerion was the name she gave to the little black cat. Balerion was also the name of the huge black dragon that Aegon rode when he conquered Westeros. The total length was even more than 150 meters. It was called the Black Death, the real overlord of the sky. The girl just took the opportunity to tease Viserys. But Rhaenys didn't know all about the name Balerion. Listen to me, both of you. I'll give you some general knowledge. Viserys held the table with one hand and sighed. Balerion is not only the name of the cat and Aegon's dragon Black Death, but also the name of a god in the ancient Valyrian civilization. Meow. As Viserys was talking, the little black cat jumped in from the window. Then it rubbed its furry head against Viserys' trouser leg slightly. It really thought Viserys was calling it just now. The silver-haired boy also squatted down and picked up the coquettish little black cat, put it in his arms, and continued to explain seriously. Although Rhaenys also received the elite education of the royal family and hired the best teachers for her, her knowledge reserve was still not as deep as Viserys. In order to trace the connection between the Black Mist and the Valyrian civilization, Viserys tirelessly read a lot of books left by this once lost civilization, and learned a lot of stories about ancient Valyria. The three dragons of Aegon the Conqueror. Balerion is one of the 5 dragons that survived the doom of Valyria, and later Vhagar and Meryxes were hatched on Dragonstone. The names of these 3 dragons are all the names of gods in Valyrian civilization. Viserys was telling the two girls about the stories of the ancient Valyrian gods. At this moment, there was a knock on his room door. Bang, bang, bang. Your Majesty. The voice of the guard came from outside the door. Sir Geoffrey wants to see you. The old knight heard that the little king had returned to Andalus from Pentus, and then rode a fast horse from the port. Viserys was slightly stunned when he heard the news that the old knight had come. Then he put down the black dragon egg in his hand, locked the box again, and put it back to its original place. Seeing Viserys close the box again, the two girls thought Viserys was going to regret it, but Viserys just shook his head. I'll go take care of something first. I'll give you these 2 dragon eggs when I come back. Then, Viserys hurriedly left the house and rushed to the hall. The current political structure of Andalus is that Viserys holds most of the power. All affairs of the entire city and soldiers are under the management and deployment of Viserys. The old knight still controls the Targaryen fleet and guards the line between the coastline and Dragonstone. Many affairs on Dragonstone are also managed by Sir Geoffrey, who is now the second in command of the Targaryen family. The power and status are deeply rooted. Even Prince Oberyn, who has made outstanding contributions in Andalus, cannot challenge the old knight's status. However, Andalus is still a long way from the coastline. Viserys did not expect the old knight to suddenly rush over from the port or Dragonstone. It must be that something important has happened. So Viserys hurried over. Your Majesty. However, when Viserys arrived at the castle's main hall, the white-haired Sir Geoffrey was already waiting here. He wore a golden badge on his chest, looking particularly energetic. Your Majesty. Your Majesty. Prince Oberyn, who was responsible for guarding the city-state and commanding 2,000 guards, and Maester Gunther of Dragonstone were also sitting here. This is the highest level meeting Linoop in Andalus now. Lord Geoffrey, it's been a long time since we last met. It seems that you are still as elegant as ever. After Viserys sat down, he greeted the old knight first. The commander-in-chief of the Dragonstone fleet, now his nominal hand of the king and the minister of the sea, is not only a beacon on his life path, but also a role like a strict father. Because they are too far apart, Sir Geoffrey returns to Dragonstone from time to time to handle affairs, and the two of them have not seen each other for more than half a year. However, the old knight is still loyal, and has no second thoughts. "Your Majesty, it's been a long time." The grey-haired old man sat on the nearest chair to Viserys' left. With a pair of slightly dim old eyes, he looked at the increasingly sharp young man in front of him, and the last bit of worry in his heart disappeared. Viserys could manage the city alone, and he did not become arrogant and extravagant because of the loss of control. Then the old knight leaned forward, straightened his face slightly, restrained his smile, and talked about business. "Your Majesty, the usurper's new fleet has been built." Chapter 97 Burning. Has it been built? After hearing the old knight's words, Viserys' face was slightly serious, but he did not seem shocked. Because the Iron Throne has been collecting intelligence from Andalus, and Andalus also has a lot of insiders in Westeros, Viserys has established a firm foothold on the continent of Essos. Now more than 24 nobles have contacted him and expressed their wishes of wishing the king good health and looking forward to the early return of the royal army. These nobles are families that suffered unfair distribution of interests or even losses after Baratheon seized the Iron Throne. After all, Robert sat on the Iron Throne, and he had to reward most of the interests to those families who followed him to launch a rebellion, and these interests were the original interests of those families who surrendered later. In this way, the vested interests will cheer, and the other part will naturally breed resentment. And this is the pain that is inevitable in the change of power. It takes a certain amount of time to run in and let them get used to accepting the distribution of interests in the post-Targaryen era. Unfortunately, the embers of Targaryen were not completely extinguished. First, they completed a GD counterattack on Dragonstone, which dealt a heavy blow to Baratheon, and then they regained their foothold in Essos, with a great momentum to make a comeback. Because of Viserys' existence, Robert, or his adoptive father, the Prime Minister Jon Arryn, wanted to use time to adjust the problem of uneven distribution of interests in the country, which was greatly prolonged. Now they need more time to make all forces in the country completely forget about Targaryen and adapt to the distribution of interests in the new era. This may also be one of the reasons why the Prime Minister finally nodded in agreement to the plan of the new fleet, and Robert was determined to destroy the remnants of Targaryen. Not long ago, Viserys had received news a few months before he was about to set off for Pentos that Baratheon's new royal fleet had been built. However, it was unexpected that it was delayed for a few months. It seems that Stannis has made sufficient preparations this time and is very cautious. Even a lot of false news was released to confuse the enemy on the other side of the narrow sea, but Targaryen was not fooled this time. After all, the previous raid had many factors such as time, place, and people, and finally achieved such a brilliant result, which is almost impossible to replicate again. If you want to raid the royal fleet led by Stannis again, you may fall into the enemy's trap and suffer heavy losses. The old knight has led the Dragonstone fleet for so many years, so he is naturally fully immersed in the art of naval warfare and is more calm in using troops. And he hurried over from Dragonstone this time to discuss the countermeasures of this matter with Viserys. Fight or retreat? The silver-haired boy wearing an ordinary coarse cloth top and breeches sat in the center of the hall of Andalus Castle, supporting his cheek with one hand, his eyes fixed on a pen on the table, and seemed a little absent-minded. In fact, Viserys had already made an arrangement for Dragonstone in his early plan. That is to retreat to the Andus Plain first, then build a castle here to gain a foothold. If Baratheon attacks Dragonstone again one day, he will take the initiative to avoid the battle and hand Dragonstone over to them. In this way, he can recover the battle line to the greatest extent, shrink his own strength, and condense into the hardest fist, and then fight back fiercely when the enemy chases to the Essos continent again. However, plans are plans, and when it comes to giving up Dragonstone, Viserys is still reluctant. Although so many years have passed, he has already scraped the ground on Dragonstone and moved everything that can be moved. Even some dragon bones. dragon crystals or obsidian, and some stones that are suspected to be dragon eggs, but when they are carefully taken out, they are found to be really just stones. Are you really going to give up Dragonstone? Viserys was a little reluctant and hesitant. Prince Oberyn, who was sitting in the first seat to Viserys' right, was crossing his legs and fingering his fingers. He looked up at the little king with his dark eyes after hearing Viserys' words. If you are unwilling to give up a little benefit, it is very likely that the whole situation will be disrupted. Prince Oberyn's words made sense. Although the man's skin was a little dark, his hair was messy, and he had a beard, which made him look a little unkempt. However, Oberyn was really not to be underestimated. He was even the most knowledgeable person among all the people present, a rare genius. Oberyn once studied in the Citadel when he was young, and he created a total of 6 bachelor's links, which symbolized that he had reached the level of a bachelor in 6 fields. And the bachelor Gunther, who was wearing a grey bachelor's robe, even called Oberyn Senior, because he only had 3 bachelor's links. The usurper's navy is not as elite as ours, but their ships are stronger and larger than ours. At this time, Maester Gunther, who was sitting next to the old knight, also spoke up. As a Maester of Dragonstone, he had been following the old knight to manage the affairs of Dragonstone during this period, and he also went to Andalus to help Viserys. Maester Gunther was even busier than them, often running back and forth between the 2 places, but fortunately he had trained apprentices to help both sides send and receive ravens normally. I understand. Viserys heard that the 3 people in the entire royal meeting believed that they should not disrupt the original plan and should continue to recuperate and wait for the right time to join Dawn to return to Westeros, and then nodded slightly. In this case, when Stannis' fleet arrives, we will take the initiative to abandon Dragonstone and retreat. Viserys made the final decision on this matter, withdrawing all his forces and continuing to recuperate in a low-key manner. Well, the old knight also nodded slightly, and this matter came to an end. However, the grey-robed Maester sitting next to him sorted out the information in his hand and raised his head again. Your Majesty, there is one more small matter. Viserys' eyes immediately fell on the Maester. What? Then, Maester Gunther took a piece of information in his hand and handed it to Viserys. This is what happened in the Iron Islands not long ago. A temple dedicated to the 7 gods was accidentally burned down in a fire, but many people think that it might not be an accident. Chapter 98 Iron Race. The great drowned god has given us courage, will and strength. On the distant Iron Islands, a long-planned carnival seemed to be taking place. A man in linen clothes was bare-chested, holding a blazing torch, chanting words full of enthusiasm and piety. Then he set the 7 gods temple in front of him on fire. These false gods and alien gods are the conspiracy of the storm god. Get them out of the drowned god's territory. According to legend, the storm god is the eternal enemy of the drowned god. The storm god lives in a palace in the clouds, and the drowned god lives in a flowing palace under the sea. When they fight, the sea will roll up strong winds and huge waves. However, like the drowned god, no one except the Ironborn believes in the existence of the storm god. The fire was burning, and billowing smoke rose up, mixed with flowing and jumping tongues of fire. The monks and nuns in the temple cried for their parents, and some fled in panic, but were hacked to death by the Ironborn waiting outside, and screamed. Some of them stayed in the temple, kneeling in front of the Father and praying loudly, as if the loud voice could strengthen their faith and suppress the fear in their hearts. They hoped that the 7 gods would bring down their power to destroy these sinners who blasphemed the gods. In fact, there were some signs of this kind of thing since a month ago. Although the number of people is relatively small, there are still some Iron people who believe in the 7 gods. However, a month ago, these Iron people who believe in the 7 gods often encountered bad things. Either the house was burned down when they went out, or the door was opened and they were stolen. It even developed to the later stage that some people specifically stared at the houses of these Iron people and threw stones, regardless of whether the other party was at home or not. There were also a series of Iron people who believed in the 7 gods being beaten or even killed in the street. It is extremely difficult to spread the teachings of the 7 gods in the Iron Islands. However, despite these difficult challenges, the monks of the temple still did not give up and were still struggling to support. But they did not expect that it would become like this now. A group of fanatical followers of the drowned god first burned down the 7 sacred temple on Great White Island, and then the church on Old White Island was also besieged. All the monks were killed, and the nuns were also treated cruelly. The situation suddenly took a sharp turn for the worse, and became uncontrollable at an unexpected speed. On Pike Island, the most prosperous island in the Iron Islands, the monks who believed in the 7 sacred temples sought refuge from the Greyjoy family in the name of the Archbishop in King's Landing, asking the Greyjoy family to send troops to suppress the rebellion and protect the temple from being attacked. However, the city of Pike drove these monks out of here, telling them that this was not a rebellion, but just the choice of the Ironmen themselves. Then, before these monks could escape from King's Harbor, this happened. Even if they wanted to escape now, they couldn't. Along with the loud prayers of the monks, the burning flames gradually engulfed them, and then turned into shrill screams. The house of the 7 sacred temple finally collapsed in the flames, and was completely destroyed. Charge. Then a group of Ironmen who had been waiting for a long time, and were not afraid of death, rushed up, and began to pick up the wealth in the temple that was not melted by the flames. Brother. Tap tap tap. In Pike, the home of the Greyjoy family, a hurried sound of footsteps was heard outside the hall. Then a tall, pale-skinned man walked in quickly from outside. He had black hair and a beard, a bright blue eye that was often called a smiling eye, and his other left eye was covered by a black eye patch. Few people have seen what color his eyes were under the eye patch, whether they were still smiling or full of bitterness and malice. Urine. Sitting on the cold throne in the hall was a thin man with long messy black hair, a sharp face, and a pair of sharp black eyes with the character of all Ironmen, stubborn, fearless, and competitive. He was Euron's brother, the current Lord of the Iron Islands, Balon of the Greyjoy family. You are not young anymore. Why are you still so unstable? At this moment, Balon's eyes were calm, looking at his younger brother Euron, who hurried in from outside the hall. Brother is right. Euron did not say anything more after hearing his elder brother's criticism, but just smiled coldly, showing his pale teeth. But what I want to say is this action a bit too hasty? What happened in King's Harbor outside today was actually secretly supported by the Greyjoy family. And since a month ago, the Drowned God movement that suddenly burned in the entire Iron Islands was also secretly carried out under their instructions. The whole thing was planned by Balon and his brothers, so Euron naturally knew the inside story. But he felt that all this could be done slowly mobilizing the Ironborn's fanatical belief in the ancient road, and there was no need to be so hasty. However, Euron did not expect the plan to be advanced, and all this was like pressing the accelerator key, and the fanatical belief of the Ironborn began to ferment rapidly, and then reached an uncontrollable point. Now that the sept has been burned down, and the monks have been killed, there is a sign of unrest. Even if they don't want to launch the plan, they can't stop. We could have continued to let the dragon cub on the continent of Essos delay the attention of the Iron Throne. Take your time. Euron sat carelessly on a chair next to his brother Balon, then took an apple from the fruit plate beside him, and took a bite. This is their plan. Use Viserys to delay time, accumulate enough strength, and even secretly form an alliance with the Targaryens to instigate a war between the Iron Throne and the Targaryens. Then, while the two sides are fighting, and unable to take care of themselves, launch a rebellion, call themselves the King of the Iron Islands, and stab them in the back. However, Euron didn't expect that his elder brother Balon would advance the plan without authorization, and now he is in a situation where he can't get off the tiger. After this matter is reported, King's Landing will definitely criticize them and ask them to hand over the murderer. However, if the Iron Islands really handed over the murderer, the prestige of the Greyjoy family among the Ironborn would plummet, and the sentiment of following the old ways that had been aroused with great difficulty would be doused with a basin of water, leaving a chill in the heart. HMPH, what do you know? However, Balon just snorted coldly. He actually didn't want to launch the plan so early, but many times, the big plans were ruined by the hands of ordinary people. Balon didn't expect that the Ironborn he secretly arranged would actually brainwash themselves. Fanatical belief in the old ways, even to the point of madness, and then suddenly overdoing it. Chapter 99, King of the Iron Islands. In the year 289 of the Conquest era, Balon Greyjoy, Lord of the Iron Islands, arrived on Old White Island by boat. Surrounded by guards, he entered the Ironborn's holy place, the Grey King's Hall. Since ancient times, the Ironborn have held a king selection here to decide their monarch. Lord Balin. Lord Balin. The Ironborn who were blocked by the guards cheered enthusiastically when they saw Balin Greyjoy. In their eyes, Balin was the most staunch supporter of the ancient way. They believed that Balin would lead the Ironborn to restore the glory of the ancient times. However, Balin Greyjoy, surrounded by guards, just waved to the Ironborn outside, and then did not stay for too long, and then entered the Grey King's Hall. This Grey King's Hall is a holy place for the Ironborn, because it is a hall made of the ribs of the Naga. According to legend, Naga was the first sea dragon in the world, the most powerful creature born in the sea. The giant sea monsters and sea beasts that the Ironborn feared were just food in front of it. When Naga was angry, she could even swallow an entire island. However, the Grey King, a hero born in the Dawn Age, killed Naga himself. The drowned god turned Naga's bones into fossils, so that the Ironborn would always remember the achievements of the first king. Naga's ribs became the beams and pillars of the Grey King's Hall, and its mouth was used as his throne, and its teeth were his towering pale crown. My king. This way. Taller, a priest of the drowned god known as the Three-Drowned Man, guided Balin. Balin Greyjoy wore a black cloak and a dark fur cape, and then he lifted the hem of his clothes, and sat on the shiny black stone throne. This black stone throne is called the Seaston Seat. It is the ancient throne of the Iron Islands. It looks like a giant sea monster, and is carved from a dark and shiny boulder. Legend has it that when the ancestors first set foot on Old Wyke, this boulder was lying on the beach of Old Wyke. Because of the wind and sun, the Blackstone throne does not feel very good to sit on. It feels cold and even a little uncomfortable. However, Balin remained calm. His angular cheeks were like flint chisels, his black eyes were cold, and his long hair was scattered and fluttering in the wind. Then, Taller, the priest of the drowned god, stood in front of the Seaston seat and recited the coronation oath loudly. The cold wind penetrated his clothes and poured into his body. His brothers Euron, Victarion, Aeron, etc. stood on his left and watched the coronation ceremony of the King of the Iron Islands quietly. Balin's wife and children, his wife Alanis Harrod, his eldest son Roderick, his second son Meryn, his daughter Asha, and his youngest son Theon all stood on the right side of the Blackstone throne. Since the War of Conquest, the tough Ironborn have been ruled by the cowards of the Greenlands, and have lost the ancient ways they honor. The drowned god priest Taylor gave a loud speech. The guards below protected the Grey King's Hall in the center in 3 layers, and the barren hills outside the guards were filled with high-spirited Ironborn. When the flame of restoring the ancient ways began to burn in the hearts of the Ironborn, even Balin Greyjoy could not forcibly extinguish the flame, and could only bite the bullet, and continue to move forward. The great drowned god has passed down his will. It is required that Balin Greyjoy, the descendant of the Grey King, inherit the title of King of the Iron Islands, wear the crown, and lead us on a new journey. In the Grey King's Hall, the loud voice next to the Blackstone throne still spread far away. The Greyjoy family claimed to have inherited the blood of the Grey King, and therefore had the right to rule the Iron Islands from the root. King Balin. Long live King Balin. The Ironman below roared like a tsunami, and for a time, the crowd was indignant, and the desires and evil thoughts burning in the blood of the Ironman began to stir. Getting something for nothing is the most original evil thought rooted in everyone's heart, and perhaps not just the Ironman. They longed to restore the ancient ways, the poor wanted to plunder the wealth of others to end their poverty, and the men wanted to plunder the wives and daughters of others to become their concubines. And the women of the Ironborn could also fight like men, board longships to plunder the stupid and cowardly Greenland, and even become captains, to command their own ships. It was the drowned god in the sea that gave them the same desires as men. Then, the 3 drowned men Tal saw the crowd below was indignant, and the emotions and atmosphere had reached a climax, and then he held the driftwood crown in his hand, and personally put it on Balin Greyjoy's head. The coronation ceremony was completed. Then he stood up from the Seaston throne as Balin Greyjoy IX. The news of the rebellion in the Iron Islands spread quickly to all parts of the 7 kingdoms. Balin Greyjoy, the Lord of the Iron Islands, wore the crown, and called himself the Iron King, Balin IX. His wife became the queen, and his children were called princes. Then, under the planning of Balin's second brother Euron, The Iron Fleet led by his third brother Victorian attacked Lannisport unexpectedly, burning the Lannister fleet stored in the port, and all the warships in the Westerlands were buried in the sea, losing their ability to sail on the sea. In an instant, the news of Balon's coronation as king of the Iron Islands rebellion and the annihilation of the Lannisport naval battleships shocked the entire Seven Kingdoms. It is said that King Robert, who was drunk, smashed several valuable vases that night and was furious. Then he vowed to personally lead the army to cut off Balon's head and hang it on the top of the Red Castle. Finally, after the bitter persuasion of the Prime Minister Jon Arryn, he gave up the idea of leading the army in person. Then the next day after the news came back, the king's order came out from the Red Castle. King Robert mobilized all the loyal vassals in the Seven Kingdoms to lead the army to attack the Iron Islands and quell the rebellion. The royal fleet led by the king's second brother Stannis, which was heading to Dragonstone to conquer it first, also received the king's order. Then he was forced to temporarily abandon the previous plan and turn the bow to participate in the rebellion war in the Iron Islands. And on the other side of the Narrow Sea, it was more than a month later when Viserys received this news. Now the little king is studying his black dragon egg in the castle. On an iron grill, the heavy black dragon egg was placed on it, and a blazing bonfire was lit below. The flames surged, and the smoke billowed into the sky as Viserys roasted a dragon egg. However, the dragon egg itself lay quietly on the bonfire, as if nothing had happened. Chapter 100 Hatching Eggs. Viserys squatted in the courtyard, holding a piece of firewood in his hand, and stirring the bonfire from time to time, and in the other hand he used a fan to fan the smoke blowing in his direction. However, the dragon egg just lay quietly on the bonfire, letting the raging flames devour it but remaining indifferent. The servants passing by watched the little king squatting in the yard playing with fire from a distance, and then gathered together to whisper quietly, but they were too far away for Viserys to know what they were talking about, and he had no time to care at the moment. Viserys desperately fanned the wind with one hand, but he couldn't fan the smoke blowing in his direction. In the end, the little king could only flee in embarrassment, changing direction and continuing to poke the fire with a stick until the firewood in his hand was lit, and then throwing it into the bonfire to replace it with a new one. Cough cough. Viserys' usually fair and handsome cheeks were smoked a little black, and his nose and tears flowed down, looking a little embarrassed. During this time, Viserys and the other two girls were studying how to hatch their dragon eggs. Viserys actively adopted a series of methods, such as dripping blood, roasting with fire, flooding, etc., and even sacrificed a death row prisoner, but none of them worked. And Rhaenys was still quite energetic in the first few days, and seriously studied how to hatch dragon eggs. However, after a few days, her eagle did not move at all, and the girl gradually lost her patience. She took a hammer and knocked it several times, but couldn't crack it open, and then Rhaenys gave up the research completely. She forced the little black cat to help her hatch the dragon eggs, and she ran out to play. The little black cat Poliwian was confused and was helplessly locked in a cage by his owner and a stone. The cat and the egg depended on each other in the cage. As for Daenerys, she neither learned to play with fire like Viserys, nor persecuted small animals like Rhaenys. The silver-haired girl deeply remembered a sentence her brother once said. Although I don't know how many years have passed since these 3 dragon eggs have become fossils, but I believe that if you incubate them carefully, you may be able to hatch dragon babies. Because of this sentence, Daenerys was very careful about hatching dragon eggs. She put her Viserion on the bed in the bedroom and would sleep with her dragon eggs in her pajamas every night. At first, Viserys wondered if Daenerys would catch a cold if she slept with a cold big stone every day. However, Daenerys told him that the dragon eggs were not cold. Although she felt that they were not warm, they were at least the normal room temperature. From then on, Viserys gave up the idea of stopping Daenerys from sleeping with the dragon eggs, and at the same time he had the greatest expectations for Daenerys, because he felt that the pale milky white dragon egg was completely cold. The dragon eggs are really not wrong. If he was not sure that these 3 dragon eggs could really hatch 3 giant dragons flying in the sky, Viserys would even think that his inner perception of the dragon eggs was wrong. However, the dragon egg was real, but he was still unable to hatch it, which also troubled him. except for Daenerys' special reaction to the dragon egg. That is, Daenerys felt the dragon egg warmer than them. There was no other abnormality. Then, the silver-haired boy in front of the bonfire stretched out his hand tentatively. His fingers were reaching out to the blazing flames, and he stretched out his hand repeatedly on the verge of death. The heat wave that hit him even made him feel a little suffocated, but the boy's throat rolled, and finally he encouraged himself, strengthened his will, and then continued to stretch his hand forward. How at this time, a gust of wind blew, and the dancing flames in the bonfire flowed, and the flames burned the boy's fingers. Viserys felt a clear burning sensation, and then he quickly retracted his hand, as if he was electrocuted. Hiss! Viserys took a breath of cold air. It only took a moment to be burned by the fire, but the pain came immediately afterwards. But it was not as painful as imagined. Viserys rubbed the burned area vigorously for a few times, but found that his fingers were still white and smooth, and not burned by the flames, so he was slightly relieved. It seems that the idea of jumping into the fire pit with a death row prisoner holding a dragon egg is not realistic. Viserys had no choice but to give up the bold idea. Although it has been a while since the dragon egg was obtained, Viserys has no way to deal with it. No wonder Illyrio is willing to give it away. No wonder a precious dragon egg is only worth the price of a ship. If the dragon egg can be hatched, it will not be exchanged for 100 ships. But if the dragon egg cannot be hatched, it is only worth collecting and viewing. At this time, Your Majesty, a slightly fat and ugly woman pulled a boy about the same age as Daenerys. She saw Viserys playing with fire here, and then walked over. Do you want to hatch the dragon egg? This woman was the Azalin priestess, Miri Mazdur, who intended to do something wrong to Viserys on the ship to Bravos. She has now completed the punishment that Viserys gave her, and was released from prison. Then, 2 years ago, Miri received the news that her mother had passed away from her hometown, and then she cried bitterly. But Miri did not follow her mother's will and return to her hometown to become an unknown priest. Instead, she continued to stay in Andalus to answer some questions about magic and mysticism for Viserys, and the woman continued to observe the secrets of Viserys. However, after so many years, Miri found nothing except that the boy was growing up at a terrifying speed. She used to be able to see that the magic in Viserys' body was becoming stronger and stronger with his growth, but in recent years Miri could not even observe this. Viserys' body was like a layer of black fog, making it unpredictable. However, whether as a priestess or as a witch, Miri had a whim in her heart during this period. She seemed to smell the restless smell in the air, and the violently beating heart in her chest told her that the power of magic seemed to be returning. It's not far away. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.